They ruled empires, but couldn't tie their own shoes. Born into crowns and coffins alike, these kings and queens weren't just royalty, they were family reunions with chromosomes missing. From Spain's drooling dynasty to Egypt's incestuous pharaohs, their bloodlines loop tighter than a noose. This isn't just history, it's a genetic horror show disguised in lace and velvet. So grab your goblet, brace your jaw, and pray your ancestors had better judgment, because these are the 30 most inbred kings and queens in history, and their biggest enemy wasn't rebellion, it was themselves. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a journey into history's strangest corners. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let's see how far this royal madness reaches. Charles II of Spain. If you ever wondered what happens when a family tree turns into a family wreath, Charles II of Spain is your answer, and not a subtle one. Known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, Charles didn't need sorcery to explain his condition. Just a genealogical diagram that reads like a loop of Uncle Mary's niece and Cousin Mary's cousin, repeated until God stopped looking. Charles II was the final boss of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty so inbred that their official motto might as well have been "No outsiders allowed," especially not genetically. His great-great-grandparents were the same people on both sides. His family had perfected the art of keeping their royal blood pure, by which they meant stagnant, swampy, and barely flowing. From the moment Charles was born in 1661, it was obvious something was off. He couldn't talk until he was 4, couldn't walk until 8. His jaw was so oversized and distended, the infamous Habsburg jaw, that he couldn't chew properly or close his mouth. You'd think at least that would give him an advantage in court gossip. Nope. He also suffered from seizures, frequent fevers, impotence, and a tragic lack of basic awareness. By all accounts, Charles had the cognitive sharpness of a cheese sandwich. Despite being king of one of the most powerful empires in Europe, Charles had less control over his destiny than a chess pawn trapped behind a bishop with arthritis. He was incapable of governing, which was unfortunate, because everyone around him was equally incapable of not trying to govern through him. Ministers, nobles, priests, mistresses, exorcists, you name it, lined up to manipulate his every move like he was a drooling marionette in an embroidered cape. The crown, of course, needed an heir, which presented a slight problem. Charles couldn't father one. His first marriage, to Marie-Louise of Orleans, lasted 10 years and produced 0 children, though countless prayers and royal baby announcements were printed in advance, just in case divine intervention decided to show up. It never did. After Marie-Louise died, probably from sheer stress, Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was known for her aggressive fertility. Still nothing. Rumor has it the only thing Charles ever successfully impregnated was a chair cushion during a seizure. The doctors, in a desperate last-ditch act of 17th century medical science, blamed witchcraft, obviously. Because when you've married your niece, and your niece is also your cousin, and your body is falling apart like a cheap puppet in a thunderstorm, the only logical conclusion is demonic possession. Exorcisms were conducted. Spells were cast. Saints were invoked like tech support on hold. But the real demon was upstairs, entrenched in the royal skull, planted there by centuries of incest, like a genetic landmine waiting to go off. Charles died childless at the age of 38, which, given his health, was a small miracle. With his death came the War of the Spanish Succession, because even in death, Charles managed to mess things up for everyone. His will had named a French Bourbon as successor, which pissed off the Habsburgs in Austria, Britain, and basically every other European power with a map. The result? Years of chaos, bloodshed, and treaties no one read until they were rewritten in French. And so Charles II became not only the final chapter of the Spanish Habsburgs, but also their greatest cautionary tale. A human relic preserved by arrogance, paranoia, and an unwavering belief that bloodlines were more important than brains. It turns out, if you keep the blood pure long enough, it forgets how to circulate. But Charles wasn't history's only royal science experiment gone wrong. Before him, there was another young king, celebrated more for his golden tomb than his cracked DNA. His parents were brother and sister. His advisors were gods. His foot didn't work. And somehow, 3,000 years later, he's still getting MRI scans. Let's talk about Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun of Egypt. If Charles II was the tragic punchline of inbreeding, then Tutankhamun was its origin myth, a glittering corpse propped up by gold, mystique, and the collective silence of ancient Egyptian medicine. A boy king who ruled more like a human artifact than a pharaoh, Tutankhamun wasn't just the son of a god king, he was also the son of a sister, wife, literally. His father was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, and his mother also, Akhenaten's full sister, was left so unnamed in records that Egyptologists just call her the younger lady, as if that makes it less creepy. From the outside, King Tut's life looks like a Hollywood epic, golden sarcophagus, towering pyramids in the background, a destiny carved in stone. But peel back the gilded mask and you find something more disturbing. A frail, club-footed teenager with a cleft palate, necrotic bones, and DNA twisted tighter than a papyrus scroll left in the sundae. Let's talk about the walking disaster that was Tutankhamun's genome. His family line had practiced incest as both a religious devotion and a political strategy. The pharaohs believed they were descended from gods, so obviously marrying your sister wasn't just acceptable, it was sacred. Unfortunately, the gods had not studied genetics. The result? Tutankhamun was a living warning label. His bones were riddled with deformities. His left foot was severely clubbed, requiring a cane to walk. Actually, make that multiple canes. Over 130 of them were found in his tomb. Either he had a limp or a stick fetish. Given the rest of his condition, we'll go with the former. He also had scoliosis, malformed ribs, possibly epilepsy, and malaria. That's right, malaria. Because apparently, being the living product of a sibling marriage wasn't hard enough, Tut also had to contract a parasitic disease that makes your organs stew from the inside out. Medical scans of his mummy show signs of osteonecrosis in the bones, which is a fancy way of saying parts of him were rotting away before he even died. His physical condition was so catastrophic that some researchers speculate he could barely stand unassisted. Imagine being worshipped as a living god, but having to be propped up like a badly jointed mannequin just to greet your court. But perhaps the most tragic part wasn't the pain, it was the futility. Tutankhamun ruled for about 9 years, assuming power at the age of 9 and dying at around 18 or 19. He wasn't a great warrior, nor a master statesman. He didn't commission world-changing monuments. What he did do was try awkwardly to reverse the radical religious reforms of his father. Akhenaten had thrown out Egypt's entire pantheon and declared the sun disk Aten as the sole deity. This didn't go over well. Tut's reign mostly involved trying to undo all of that. A child king backpedaling through divine bureaucracy with a crumbling skeleton and a borrowed headdress. His death was as mysterious as his life was miserable. Theories abound. A chariot accident, unlikely, given his clubfoot. A blow to the head, probably just post-mortem damage. Or a cascade of disease, infection, and good old-fashioned genetic collapse. No one really knows. What is known is that his tomb, tiny, rushed, and probably not meant for him, was sealed and forgotten for centuries. Then came 1922. Enter Howard Carter, British archaeologist and part-time looter with a flair for drama. When he opened Tutankhamun's tomb, the modern world collectively lost its mind. Here was a teenage mummy buried in gold, surrounded by daggers, jewels, and 2 miniature coffins containing his stillborn daughters, also likely the products of incest, by the way, since he married his half-sister, Ankhesenamun. Of course he did. It was practically a family tradition. The Curse of the Pharaoh headlines wrote themselves. Mysterious deaths followed the tomb's opening. Was it ancient magic? Mold spores? Poetic justice? Doesn't matter. What really mattered was that Tutankhamun became famous not for what he did, but for what his bones failed to do. Hold him together. He is remembered not as a leader, but as a symbol of divine vanity, royal self-destruction, and the glittering fragility of dynastic isolation. His face, once hidden beneath a death mask, now sells museum tickets and children's books. His name is known in every language. And yet, when we speak it, we are really whispering about what happens when gods ignore biology. But Egypt wasn't the only empire addicted to keeping it in the family. Fast forward nearly 2,000 years, and Spain would pick up the same hobby with even more disastrous results. Because, while Tut was born to a brother and sister, our next monarch chose to marry his niece willingly, strategically, lovingly. His name? Philip IV of Spain. Philip IV of Spain. Philip IV of Spain didn't stumble into inbreeding the way a careless royal might fall into a tragic romance or an accidental war. No, Philip IV married his niece like a man ordering the family special at a restaurant with only one item on the menu. Her name was Mariana of Austria, and her genes already matched his like puzzle pieces from the same defective box. The marriage wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. And why not? It was tradition. It was policy. It was destiny. And it was absolutely, irreparably, genetically disastrous. To understand Philip IV, you need to imagine a monarch who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade, smiled like it hurt, and ruled as if the Spanish Empire was a particularly exhausting board game. His court was ornate, bloated, and populated with whispering sycophants who believed bloodlines were more important than competence because they were. Philip's entire reign was built on the idea that royalty must remain pure, which in Habsburg terms meant keep it in the family until the family resembles an oil painting melting in the sundae. But Philip didn't start with Mariana. No, he had a warm-up. His first wife was Elizabeth of France, relatively unrelated, surprisingly lively, and an unfortunate accident of moderation. They had children, some of whom even lived a while. But fate, or perhaps genetic strategy, intervened when Elizabeth died, leaving Philip both widowed and dangerously open to marrying someone outside the gene pool. Heaven forbid. So the court did what it always did. It scoured the family tree for a replacement and found one conveniently curled up in the branches, Mariana of Austria, Philip's sister's daughter. A teenage girl with a Habsburg jaw you could hang a curtain on. She was shipped off to Spain and married to her uncle because that's how dynasties ensured loyalty, not through diplomacy or shared ideals, but through aggressively recursive DNA. The wedding was a grand affair. The people cheered, the portraits were painted, and somewhere, in the echo chamber of royal genetics, another mutation quietly celebrated its future. Philip and Mariana's marriage was not romantic. He was 30 years older and emotionally somewhere between distracted and indifferent. She was a pious teenager, neurotic and deeply uncomfortable in her new role as queen and niece. But they produced children. Most of them died quickly. One, however, survived long enough to become a monument to their shared bloodline, Charles II, the same sad, twitching disaster we met at the beginning of this journey. If Charles was the result, Philip and Mariana were the formula. Philip IV wasn't oblivious. He knew Spain was crumbling. The empire, once sprawling and golden, was now drowning in wars, bankruptcies, and bureaucratic sludge. The 30 Years' War drained the treasury. The peace treaties leaked territory like a cracked jug. And Philip, despite being occasionally reflective and strangely poetic in his letters, remained frozen, trapped by the expectations of his role, the burdens of his office, and the uncomfortable reality that his family's proudest legacy was slowly becoming Europe's most whispered joke. He died in 1665, leaving behind a child king who couldn't rule, a queen widow who couldn't stop praying, and a royal line that looked like it had been drawn in circles with a broken crayon. Philip IV's legacy is a strange one, not just as a monarch, but as a living symbol of the slow, deliberate collapse of dynastic logic. He was a patron of the arts, commissioning the great Diego Velázquez. He presided over the Spanish Golden Age in literature, even while his politics helped dim the empire's glow. But no painting, no novel, no velvet-draped ceremony could obscure the hard truth. The greatest act of his reign was marrying a genetic mirror and hoping for the best. But don't worry, we're not done with Mariana just yet. Because unlike most royal consorts, Mariana of Austria had a starring role in the ongoing genetic opera. And if you thought marrying your uncle was peak inbred drama, wait until you see what happens when she becomes the de facto ruler of Spain, raising a boy whose chromosomes read like a family reunion guest list. Mariana of Austria. In the tragic operetta of Habsburg Spain, Mariana of Austria played the part of both ingenue and accidental villain, a niece turned wife turned mother turned regent, who spent her adult life watching the empire unravel like a lace cuff in a sword fight. If Philip IV was the architect of the disaster, Mariana was the caretaker of the smoldering ruins. And like any proper Habsburg, she did it with a face carved from family resemblance and a soul crushed by divine obligation. Let's start with the basics. Mariana was 15 when she married her uncle, a man who could have doubled as her father and very nearly was. The union was arranged with all the enthusiasm of a church funeral. She was Austrian, devout, and exactly what the Spanish court was looking for, pure Habsburg stock, unblemished by outside influence. The family tree might as well have been a circle drawn in royal ink, with Mariana and Philip smiling from the same quadrant. Their wedding was a show, as always. Trumpets, incense, processions. But beneath the powdered wigs and embroidered vows, there was something unmistakably grim. Mariana was not a charismatic queen. She was shy, anxious, burdened by a religiosity so intense it could make a bishop sweat. She brought with her a suitcase of relics, prayer books, and medical anxieties. Her journals read like a confessional booth during a power outage. Endless guilt, metaphysical dread, and confusion over why her prayers didn't seem to work. Then came Charles. When Mariana gave birth to Charles II, it was clear from day one that the child was unwell. The royal doctors flailed. The priests whispered. The wet nurses prayed harder. But even they couldn't miss the signs. The oversized tongue, the misshapen head, the inability to feed without choking. This wasn't just a sickly child. This was an omen, a twitching symbol of centuries of bloodlines tightening around themselves like a noose. And yet, Mariana loved him, fiercely, perhaps obsessively. Whether out of guilt or genuine affection. She devoted herself entirely to Charles's survival, treating his feeble life as a kind of divine test. Her regency began after Philip's death, when Charles was just a spectral 6-year-old with the constitution of a Victorian poetry student. For the next 20 years, Mariana tried to rule Spain through a haze of political infighting, clerical manipulation, and her own chronic indecisiveness. It did not go well. Her court was riddled with factions. She leaned heavily on Jesuit confessors, foreign advisors, and family connections that only deepened the rot. The empire continued to crumble. War losses, colonial uprisings, economic paralysis. Spain, once the terror of Europe, had become a bureaucratic corpse held together with court etiquette and rosary beads. Mariana responded by doubling down on piety. She fasted, she wept, she wrote to saints. Meanwhile, Charles continued to deteriorate, a puppet of divine kingship too weak to stand upright during ceremonies without help. People began to murmur. Was Mariana a regent or a cloistered nun playing politics in drag? Was she protecting Charles or hiding behind him? Foreign ambassadors sent reports describing the Spanish court as an asylum run by the sick and supervised by the devout. And still Mariana clung to power not out of greed, perhaps, but out of fear. Fear that if she let go, the whole rotten structure would collapse on top of her and her saintly, sputtering son. In the end, Mariana's reign was defined not by success, but by tragic devotion. She tried to keep the ghost of an empire alive using incense and good breeding, neither of which proved particularly effective. She outlived her son barely, and died as she had lived, surrounded by holy objects, fading portraits, and the echoing cough of an empire that once roared. But for all her flaws, Mariana wasn't the only one to keep Habsburg genetics spiraling inward. Before her, another Habsburg ruler had flirted with that same brand of dynastic doom, only this one sat on the imperial throne in Austria and had his own niece bride to show for it. So let's take a brief detour eastward, into the court of Leopold I of Austria, musician, emperor, and uncle, husband extraordinaire. Leopold I of Austria. If the Spanish Habsburgs were the cautionary tale, then the Austrian Habsburgs were the sequel that read all the warnings, nodded solemnly, and said, "Let's double down." Enter Leopold of Austria, Holy Roman Emperor, patron of the arts, wearer of massive wigs, and yes, another monarch, who looked at his niece and thought, perfect wife material. Leopold was born in 1640, into a family already dizzy from how many cousin marriages it took to get there. His father, Ferdinand III, had married within the approved bloodlines, and his mother, Mariana of Spain, was a product of multiple overlapping Habsburg family branches, meaning that Leopold entered the world with a royal resume and a genetic blueprint best described as circular. His jawline could have opened bottles. His chin looked like it was sculpted by someone with a vendetta against symmetry. And his forehead, well, let's just say it arrived several seconds before the rest of his face. But Leopold didn't just inherit the problem, he expanded it. At first, things were looking promising. Leopold was bright, well-educated, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply pious in that special Habsburg way that involved collecting relics and writing long letters about sin while casually marrying his own relatives. He loved music, composed sacred works, and fancied himself a warrior poet. His court was a swirling mess of theological debate, operas, and nervous glances at the royal nursery. In 1666, Leopold married Margaret Theresa of Spain, his niece. Not just any niece either. She was the daughter of his sister, Mariana, and his uncle, Philip IV, meaning she was both Leopold's niece and his cousin twice over. If Charles II of Spain was the twisted fruit of this marriage, Leopold was the other half of the tree branch that bent just far enough to snap. Margaret was 15. Leopold was 26. The marriage was arranged like all good royal matches, with a complete disregard for medical science and a deeply sincere hope that God would sort it out. To her credit, Margaret was described as lively and charming, albeit with the telltale Habsburg features, protruding jaw, narrow hips, and a genetic resume that looked like a family reunion seating chart. She gave birth multiple times, but most of the children died early. One daughter, Maria Antonia, survived long enough to be married off naturally to yet another cousin. Leopold didn't stop there. After Margaret's death, at age 21, from exhaustion or possibly existential despair, he remarried his first cousin, Claudia Felicitas of Austria. Again, the children didn't last, but third time's the charm, right? Nope. His final wife, Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, was not a close cousin by Habsburg standards, more of a genetic coffee break, and she finally produced a healthy heir, Joseph I. Healthy enough, anyway. Through all this, Leopold ruled the Holy Roman Empire with the steady hand of a man trying to conduct a symphony while tap dancing through a religious war. He spent decades battling the Ottomans, pushing back French expansion under Louis XIV, and attempting to keep his empire from shattering under the weight of its own absurd family dynamics. And in between these geopolitical crises, he signed off on marriage contracts that would make any geneticist lose sleep. What makes Leopold especially intriguing is that he didn't see any of this as strange. To him, and to the entire Habsburg machinery, consanguinity wasn't a glitch, it was the feature. It preserved royal legitimacy, tied territories together, and ensured that power remained concentrated in the right set of unstable hands. Marrying a niece wasn't scandalous, it was efficient. Of course, efficiency has its costs. The Habsburgs continued to pass along their signature features, the jaw, and oh yes, the jaw. But more importantly, they passed along a growing pile of hereditary disorders, infant mortalities, and monarchs who were increasingly unable to fulfill even ceremonial duties without medical intervention. Leopold died in 1705, age 65, outliving most of his wives and many of his children. His empire survived barely, but his family line was like a tower made of wet playing cards. The walls were still standing, but everyone could hear the shuffle. Still, if you think Leopold was bad, just wait. His distant cousin Ferdinand I of Austria took inbreeding to its logical conclusion. Born with water on the brain, plagued by seizures, and barely coherent, and yet he still ended up emperor. Because in the Habsburg world, it wasn't about being functional. It was about being born with the right last name, Ferdinand I of Austria. If the Habsburg dynasty were a novel, Ferdinand I of Austria would be the page where the margins start collapsing inward, the ink blurs, and the sentence structure has a seizure. Born in 1793 and crowned emperor in 1835, Ferdinand wasn't just a product of inbreeding, he was the human consequence of a centuries-long experiment in dynastic recursion. His family's motto may as well have been, "Why outsource genes when we can keep remixing our own?" By the time Ferdinand showed up, the Habsburgs had been marrying their cousins for so long that their family tree looked less like a lineage and more like a Mobius strip made of parchment and denial. His parents, Emperor Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, were double first cousins, meaning they shared all four grandparents. Statistically speaking, Ferdinand had the genetic variety of a photocopy of a cousin. From the moment he was born, the signs were clear. Ferdinand had hydrocephalus fluid on the brain, which left his head visibly enlarged and his cognitive development delayed. He suffered from epilepsy, and not the occasional fainting spell kind. We're talking full-blown, chronic, seizing in public epileptic episodes that could knock him out mid-sentence. His speech was slurred, his motor skills clumsy, and his mental processing foggy on a good day. On a bad day, he'd forget what day it was, or what year, or whether he was supposed to be ruling an empire. But this was the Habsburg monarchy. Competence was optional. Bloodline was not. So despite being barely able to dress himself, Ferdinand was crowned Emperor of Austria at the age of 42 after his father abdicated. It wasn't a coronation so much as a ceremonial shrug. No one expected him to rule, least of all Ferdinand himself. His job was to wear the crown, look vaguely imperial, and not drool too much during official portraits. To manage this, the court effectively turned Ferdinand into a human screensaver. A polite blur of embroidered uniforms and confused nods paraded around state functions while an entourage of advisors, relatives, and ministers actually ran the empire. Chief among them was Prince Metternich, the man who basically babysat Europe during the post-Napoleonic hangover. Metternich liked Ferdinand just fine. He didn't talk back, didn't meddle, and didn't ask questions he couldn't pronounce. Ideal management material. Still, there were moments of unexpected lucidity. Ferdinand reportedly had a childlike innocence and a strange sense of humor. Once, after a massive banquet, he allegedly told his attendants, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." When informed that there were no more dumplings, he repeated, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." Over and over, for hours. It became something of a metaphor, a man born into ultimate power, wielding it like a confused toddler asking for snacks. His medical file was so extensive it probably required its own library wing. Alongside epilepsy and hydrocephalus, he may have had some form of intellectual disability, though. To be fair, defining intelligence in a court where half the nobles married their nieces is already an uphill battle. His wife, Mariana of Savoy, was childless, either out of mercy or divine intervention. The line would not continue through Ferdinand, which was perhaps the first truly merciful decision made on his behalf. The breaking point came in 1848, the year of revolutions. All over Europe, empires were cracking. In Vienna, riots exploded. Liberals demanded reform. The empire needed a leader. Instead, it had Ferdinand, who reportedly said, "But I'm the emperor. Why should I resign?" Shortly before doing exactly that, he abdicated in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph I, and spent the remaining decades of his life in quiet retirement at Prague Castle, tending his gardens and asking significantly fewer questions about dumplings. He lived until 1875, which, for a man with his condition, was practically a royal miracle. Or maybe just another reminder that the Habsburgs, for all their genetic chaos, had the uncanny ability to linger. Ferdinand was the end point of logic breaking down. He didn't rule an empire, he haunted one. And in his wake, the question remained, what happens when bloodlines become so obsessed with purity that they destroy the very thing they were meant to protect? Well, if you're Philip II of Spain, you don't ask that question. You repeat it, with new cousins, with more nieces, with a schedule so full of intermarriages it could double as a genealogical horror story. Let's turn the page to yet another royal who kept it in the family until the family fought back. Philip II of Spain. Philip II of Spain didn't just marry his relatives, he collected them. Like a monocled Pokemon trainer, except instead of evolving them, he just married them and watched the empire slowly unravel. If you squint hard enough, Philip's marital history isn't a list of wives, it's a flowchart of collapsing chromosomes. Let's take it from the top. Born in 1527, Philip was the son of Charles V. Yes, that Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and devourer of time zones, who decided it was perfectly reasonable to rule an empire where the sun never set and the family tree never forked. So naturally, Charles passed along both his power and his DNA like heirlooms. Philip II was a devout Catholic, a fervent administrator, and a man who believed strongly in God, bureaucracy, and the curiously divine appeal of marrying people who shared a worrying number of ancestors with him. He married 4 times. Let's go through them like symptoms in a genetic diagnosis. Wife number 1, Maria of Portugal. First cousin. They had a son, Don Carlos, who would later become a royal cautionary tale of erratic behavior, mental instability, and attempted regicide. But we'll get to that tragic sideshow later. Maria died young, perhaps from complications of childbirth, perhaps from the quiet horror of being married into the Habsburg loop. Wife number 2, Mary I of England, better known as Bloody Mary. No children, just a cross-channel alliance between Catholic cousins who mostly shared martyr complexes and awkward family dinners. Their union was a geopolitical chess move, not a romantic entanglement. Mary spent her reign burning Protestants. Philip spent it trying not to catch the English winter. He left her to manage England alone, and when she died childless, Philip shrugged and moved on to another relative. Wife number 3, Elizabeth of Valois. A slight curveball. French, young, beautiful, and not quite as closely related. This was Philip's attempt at European diplomacy, and for a while, it looked like a healthy turn. They even produced 2 surviving daughters. But Elizabeth died in her early 20s, and with her, any hope that Philip might exit the gravitational pull of his own DNA. Wife number 4, Anna of Austria. Buckle up, this one was both his niece and his 4th wife. Philip was 50, Anna was 20. She was the daughter of his sister Maria and his cousin Maximilian II, meaning their shared blood had already been around the Habsburg bloc a few too many times. Together they had several children, including a son, the future Philip III. This son, while more functional than some of his forebears, still carried the unmistakable signature of dynastic inbreeding emotional instability, health issues, and a tragic lack of adaptability. Anna herself wasn't in great shape. She was deeply religious, described as pale, quiet, and physically delicate traits the Habsburgs seemed to prize in their breeding stock, as though fragility were a sign of moral superiority. Unsurprisingly, she died young, like most royal wives tasked with producing heirs in a court that treated childbirth as both miracle and blood sport. Philip's obsession with dynastic purity wasn't just personal, it was ideological. He believed in divine monarchy, in the unity of Catholic Europe under Spanish hegemony, and in a holy mission that looked increasingly like a bureaucratic apocalypse. Under his reign, the Spanish Armada sank, the Netherlands revolted, and Portugal was temporarily annexed, because why not add another cuisine-filled kingdom to the mix? He spent his final years holed up in the austere El Escorial Palace, an architectural metaphor for his soul, rigid, cold, symmetrical, and teetering on the edge of architectural inbreeding. His body was ravaged by gout and obsessive religiosity. He dictated letters from his deathbed with trembling hands, still micromanaging church appointments and inquisitions like a man terrified of judgment, divine or dynastic. Philip II died in 1598, believing he had secured the future of Catholic Europe. In reality, he had secured the future of Europe's most fragile gene pool. His descendants continued marrying each other like a hereditary conga line, producing offspring that couldn't chew, couldn't rule, and in some cases couldn't live past infancy. But Philip's 4th wife deserves her own spotlight. Anna of Austria wasn't just a footnote in his obsessive quest for bloodline purity. She was the willing participant, the niece-turned-queen, the smiling ghost who carried Habsburg doom in her womb. Let's open her chapter and see what happens when two branches of the same tree try to make fruit. Anna of Austria. Anna of Austria had the unfortunate honor of being born into a world where the two greatest assets a Habsburg woman could possess were 1. A functioning womb, and 2. No new blood. She fulfilled both requirements to near fatal precision. Daughter of Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, Anna wasn't just Philip II's niece, she was his dynastic echo. Her face, her blood, her genes, they all came pre-approved, pre-sorted, and dangerously pre-recycled. In other words, she was exactly what Spain wanted in a queen, which was also exactly why it all went wrong. Anna entered this world in 1549, already glowing with divine promise. Her parents, first cousins of course, represented the fusion of two Habsburg lines, Austrian and Spanish, both bent on preserving power through the most literal definition of close relations. When Anna was proposed as a bride to her uncle Philip, nobody in the family blinked. Why would they? Uncle-niece marriages weren't taboo in their circles, they were preferred. It kept the empire tidy, it kept outsiders out. It also, incidentally, kept the gene pool swirling like a medieval jacuzzi. She married Philip in 1570 at the age of 21. He was 44, widowed thrice, and still mourning his third wife, Elizabeth of Valois. But grief wasn't a barrier in dynastic politics, only genetics and God. Anna walked into Philip's court as both fresh meat and familiar flesh, a tragic combo that made her simultaneously revered and replaceable. By all accounts, she was gentle, pious, and uncomplaining. Of course she was. What else could she be, in a world where her uterus was considered national infrastructure? Her primary function, producing heirs, was fulfilled with diligent suffering. She bore Philip 5 children, 4 of whom survived infancy. Not bad by royal standards. But even their survival came wrapped in ominous shadows. Her most famous child was Philip III of Spain, a monarch so uninspired, so pathologically uninterested in governing, that his entire reign was outsourced to corrupt favorites and fumbling advisors. He was, in many ways, the genetic portrait of a family that had run out of traits. The Habsburg jaw, still there. The thin, pale skin, glowing like parchment. The narrowed hips, the weak chins, the twitchy nervousness around bright lights and responsibility. All included. But back to Anna. She didn't last long in the royal role. Despite bearing multiple children and fulfilling her spiritual duties with the enthusiastic passivity of a nun in a royal costume, her health declined quickly. By age 30, she was already weakened by childbirth and chronic illnesses, her body, quite literally, crumbling under the pressure of royal expectations and inbred biology. She died in 1580, just shy of her 31st birthday, from complications likely linked to her last pregnancy. Her final contribution to Spain was a weakened heir and a worsening dynasty. Philip, in typical Habsburg fashion, mourned her with a kind of religious stoicism that mostly involved building chapels and commissioning paintings, because nothing says, "I miss you," like 3 dozen altarpieces and a vow of celibacy made 10 years too late. Anna's legacy was not in her words, few of which survived, but in her blood. She was the genetic bridge between 2 already overlapping lines. She carried within her the silent toll of cousin marriages stretching back centuries. Her children would carry that burden forward into a century defined by imperial overreach, political blundering, and nobles who looked more like wax figures than warriors. But perhaps the strangest part of Anna's story is how ordinary she seemed. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't rebellious. She was exactly what her family had always wanted: obedient, Catholic, genetically concentrated. And that is precisely why she was so dangerous. Because when a dynasty starts to reward those qualities above all others, it stops evolving, it calcifies, it breeds itself into extinction, and that extinction was already beginning to whisper through the court halls. But Anna wasn't the only royal whose madness was sewn into her chromosomes. Long before her, another queen had cracked loudly, publicly, and with heartbreaking inevitability. She was called the Mad, though madness may have been the sanest response to a family collapsing under its own bloodlines. Her name was Joanna of Castile, and her story doesn't end at loops. Just like the family tree that made her. Joanna of Castile, Joanna the Mad. History called her La Loca, the Mad, but perhaps a more accurate title would have been Joanna the Overbred, or Joanna the Systemically Broken, or even Joanna the Expected Outcome. Because when you're born to a pair of second cousins in a family already well acquainted with genetic shortcuts, and you're raised in a palace where political marriages mattered more than mental health, going mad isn't a twist, it's a prophecy fulfilled. Joanna of Castile was born in 1479 to Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. Yes, those two, the Catholic monarchs, the ones who kicked out the Moors, funded Columbus, and merged Spain into something resembling a unified kingdom. They were second cousins, which, by Habsburg standards, was practically progressive. Their genetic entanglement wasn't yet catastrophic, but it did lay the groundwork for what was to come. From a young age, Joanna was intelligent, educated, multilingual, politically savvy, and increasingly unstable. She studied Latin, theology, philosophy, and politics with tutors who praised her razor-sharp mind. But brilliance, as it turns out, doesn't protect you from hereditary neurological rot, especially when your ancestors are mostly other ancestors. Joanna was married off at age 16 to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, so named for his looks, not his parenting skills or loyalty. He was a Habsburg, of course, making him both cousin and dynastic insurance policy. The match was strategic. Spain wanted to merge with the Habsburg domains in the Low Countries, and Joanna was the human contract to make that happen. At first, the marriage seemed oddly passionate. Joanna fell hard for Philip, maybe too hard. Her obsession bordered on alarming, even in a court where women were expected to be emotionally extravagant and politically invisible. But Philip, while handsome, was also a philandering sleaze. He cheated. Openly. Repeatedly. Joanna didn't take it well. She flew into fits of rage, screamed in public, tore at her hair, threatened the other women, refused to eat, then refused to sleep. Then refused to be reasonable about any of it. Her reputation began to slip. It didn't help that her mother, Queen Isabella, was watching from a distance with the cold-eyed scrutiny of a dynastic manager. And when Philip died suddenly in 1506 at just 28, possibly from typhoid, possibly from karma, Joanna cracked. Not delicately, not quietly, fully, ferociously, and irreversibly. She refused to bury him. She kept his coffin near her. She opened it at intervals to make sure he was still there. She whispered to his corpse. At one point, she allegedly took midnight walks with his casket, traveling across the countryside like a grief-stricken ghost bride in a royal horror novel. Was it madness? Yes, probably. But it was also grief, loss, betrayal, and years of slow-burning trauma layered onto a brain already genetically compromised. Her family, of course, didn't see it that way. They saw it as a problem to be contained. Her father, Ferdinand, seized the opportunity. He declared her mentally unfit and locked her away in the convent of Tordesillas, along with her youngest daughter, for nearly 50 years. 50 years. A queen in name only, pacing stone corridors, muttering prayers, mourning a man who had betrayed her in life and abandoned her in death. Visitors described her as ghostly, pale, eerily calm one day, violently incoherent the next. Her son, Charles, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, would inherit both her throne and her blood. He barely spoke to her, treated her like a legal footnote and a necessary burden, and so she remained, imprisoned by men, religion, and her own tangled DNA. Joanna died in 1555, having outlived everyone who had locked her away. A woman whose intellect was buried beneath the same hereditary dust that would later give rise to Charles II, Ferdinand I, and all the other royal echo chambers of genetic misfortune. They called her mad, but in truth, she was a mirror held up to her dynasty, a reflection no one wanted to acknowledge. And yet, the madness didn't end with her. Because even after locking away their broken queen, the Spanish royals continued their spiral, marrying closer and closer, until the blood grew too thick to flow. One of those who kept the cycle going was Ferdinand VII, another royal with a niece for a wife, a dynasty to preserve, and a gene pool to ignore. Ferdinand VII of Spain. By the time Ferdinand VII was born in 1784, the Spanish Bourbon dynasty had already borrowed the Habsburg family playbook, set it on fire, inhaled the smoke, and declared, "More nieces, please." You'd think centuries of inbreeding would have prompted at least one royal to look at the family tree and scream, but not Ferdinand. No, Ferdinand married his niece as his fourth wife, because by that point, the only thing more sacred than the Spanish crown was the ancient family tradition of marital recursion. Ferdinand VII came into the world as the son of Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, who were, naturally, first cousins. Heir to a throne that had already seen more intermarriage than a medieval soap opera, Ferdinand inherited the Bourbon-Habsburg cocktail of arrogance, rigidity, and whatever genes were left clinging to a semblance of function. He spent his youth drifting between pious obedience and paranoid rebellion. He was neurotic, indecisive, and politically naive, a man who had the instincts of a tyrant and the backbone of a terrified notary. His early adulthood was defined less by any meaningful achievement and more by scheming against his own father, while Napoleon loomed over Europe like an imperial guillotine. And then came the part where Spain imploded. In 1808, Napoleon casually invited Ferdinand to a political meeting and, in a move that probably should have surprised no one, kidnapped him. France then installed Joseph Bonaparte as king, and Ferdinand was sent off to Chateau Valencay in France, where he spent 6 years doing little more than pacing, praying, and eating cheese. When he was finally restored to the throne in 1813, Spain expected a liberator. Instead, they got an anxious man-child obsessed with legitimacy and deeply suspicious of anything involving change, democracy, or basic motor coordination. Ferdinand immediately rolled back the progressive constitution of 1812 and declared himself absolute monarch, because obviously that's what a nation torn apart by war, rebellion, and famine really needed more absolutism. He ruled like a man trying to rewrite a play he hadn't read, relying on sycophants, religious fanatics, and his own gut feelings, which were usually wrong. And then there were the marriages. His first wife died within a year. So did the second. The third lasted longer, but the real show came in 1829, when Ferdinand, now in his mid-40s, bloated, gout-ridden, and emotionally crumbling, married his 23-year-old niece, Maria Isabel of Braganza. It was less of a love story and more of a genetic dare. Maria Isabel was the daughter of Ferdinand's sister and the King of Portugal. That made her genetically close enough to be considered property and distant enough to be passed off as fresh stock. She was devout, obedient, and tragically fertile. She gave birth to a daughter Isabella before promptly dying in childbirth at the age of 21, because of course she did. But Ferdinand got what he wanted, an heir. Unfortunately for him, she was a she. And so began the last chapter of his deeply exhausting reign. The Pragmatic Sanction, a rushed and controversial law that allowed his daughter to inherit the throne despite centuries of Salic law saying otherwise. The result? Civil war, because naturally, the Spanish aristocracy couldn't agree on whether it was better to have a queen or another male relative with a closet full of uncles. Ferdinand spent his final years riddled with illness, increasingly paranoid, and surrounded by advisors who mostly existed to say, "Yes, Your Majesty," while quietly planning their exit strategies. He died in 1833, a man who had lived through occupation, rebellion, betrayal, and at least 4 royal marriages, but somehow managed to leave his country more divided than when he found it. His daughter, Isabella II, would inherit the throne, the crown, and unsurprisingly, the legacy of inbreeding. Because Ferdinand's gift to Spain wasn't just political instability. It was a daughter who married her double first cousin, and if you don't know what a double first cousin is, well, don't worry, we're going there next. Isabella II of Spain. You'd think that after Ferdinand VII's tragicomic reign, a soap opera of botched coups, royal kidnappings, and an inbred family tree that looked more like a pretzel, Spain might pause, take a deep breath, and consider the radical act of marrying outside the bloodline. Enter Isabella II, his daughter, his legacy, and, as it turns out, the next genetic gamble in a monarchy addicted to playing Russian roulette with its own chromosomes. Born in 1830 to Ferdinand and his niece-wife Maria Isabel of Braganza, Isabella entered the world already wrapped in layers of dynastic drama. Her father, in his twilight years and desperate for an heir, had altered the law to ensure she could succeed him, a move that enraged half of Spain and kicked off the Carlist Wars, a multi-decade blood feud over whether a girl with a direct Habsburg-Bourbon genetic loop should really be in charge of an empire. By the time Isabella was crowned queen at the age of 3, Spain wasn't so much a country as a smoldering battlefield of dueling ideologies, bankrupt treasuries, and deeply unqualified nobles marrying their own nieces. As child monarchs go, she wasn't exactly set up for success. Regency passed to her mother, and then to a series of guiding hands, most of whom guided Spain directly into more chaos. And when she finally came of age, the country watched with bated breath to see who she would marry. Because of course that's what really mattered, the marriage. And oh, what a match it was. Isabella married Francisco de Assis, her double first cousin. For the uninitiated, a double first cousin means that both of your parents are siblings of both of their parents. In plain terms, your genes share not one, but 2 complete sets of grandparents. It's like trying to produce a royal heir with a Xerox machine that's already on fire. To make matters worse, or more historically inevitable, Francisco was deeply unfit for both kingship and marriage. Rumors abounded that he was effeminate, impotent, or perhaps simply disinterested in women altogether. On their wedding night, Isabella allegedly emerged furious, exclaiming that she had married a man who wore more lace than she did. Spanish historians have debated whether she was more upset by his lack of sexual interest or his superior wardrobe. But the show must go on, and Isabella went on to have 13 children, some of whom were widely rumored to be fathered by her various lovers, generals, and aides-de-camp. Whether or not Francisco was ever biologically involved remains one of those royal mysteries history is too polite to solve. Either way, the Bourbon bloodline continued, staggering along like a soap opera with no writers left in the room. Her reign wasn't much better than her marriage. She presided over a country in constant political flux, swinging between absolutist nostalgia and liberal revolution with all the grace of a mule stuck in a revolving door. Governments rose and fell faster than her court could adjust their wigs. And Isabella, caught between her conservative instincts and a progressive tide she neither understood nor trusted, ended up alienating just about everyone. By the 1862nd, her popularity had bottomed out. Her court was seen as corrupt, her ministers incompetent, her personal life scandalous, and her dynasty, well, let's just say people were starting to notice that the royal baby pictures looked a little too symmetrical. In 1868, a revolution booted her off the throne. She went into exile in France, dragging her impressive collection of perfumes and questionable decisions behind her. And yet, in true Bourbon fashion, she never truly went away. Her son, Alfonso XII, whose paternity is still a fun game for genealogists, would eventually reclaim the throne. But that's a tale for another segment. Isabella II died in 1904, fat, forgotten, and mostly forgiven. Spain, by then, had already cycled through more coups, constitutions, and colonized disasters than any one monarch could be blamed for. But Isabella's reign still stands as a cautionary tale not just about politics, but about the slow decay that sets in when a ruling class keeps choosing cousins over competence. And if her marriage to a double first cousin wasn't enough to chill your DNA, let's rewind and meet the very poster child of inbred disaster, Don Carlos of Spain. The prince whose name became shorthand for royal insanity, and the first warning sign that maybe, just maybe, the Habsburgs should have stopped inviting each other to dinner and marriage. Don Carlos of Spain. Before Charles II babbled on his throne, before Isabella II hissed about lace, before the Habsburg jaw became a mandatory accessory for Spanish royalty, there was Don Carlos. The first royal catastrophe you could watch unravel in real time. If inbreeding had a mascot, it would be him, fragile, erratic, and just dangerous enough to require round-the-clock supervision. Born in 1545, the only surviving son of Philip II and his first cousin Maria of Portugal, Don Carlos was the original warning siren screaming, "Stop marrying your relatives!" Spoiler, no one listened. Let's start with his childhood, which is to say, let's start with the red flags. Don Carlos was described early on as ill-formed in body and mind. Charming. He had one leg shorter than the other, a hunched back, and a head that looked like it had been carved by someone distracted. He reportedly suffered from frequent fevers, headaches, and random fits of rage, impressive, given that rage would become his most stable personality trait. As a teenager, Don Carlos was already a walking crisis. He killed small animals for fun. He stabbed a servant in the head. He once tried to throw a man out of a window. He liked to undress in front of strangers, randomly abuse women, and break furniture during royal audiences just to see who flinched. His tutors gave up. His doctors gave up. Even his own father, Philip II, a man who married his niece without blinking, started backing slowly out of the room. But it wasn't just madness. It was the madness of generations, neatly distilled into one noble disaster. His mother, Maria of Portugal, died days after giving birth to him. She had been a cousin of Philip, of course. Their union combined the Spanish and Portuguese royal lines in a way that made geneticists weep, and Don Carlos was the result. He wasn't just unstable. He was the product of a system that mistook closeness for strength. Philip II tried to manage him. At first, he hoped that marriage would help, that ancient royal fantasy that a wife can fix what generations of consanguinity had mangled. But every attempt to find Don Carlos a politically advantageous spouse ended in diplomatic panic. France said no. The Habsburgs said no. Even the Pope said absolutely not, and the Pope almost always said yes to kings. Don Carlos understandably didn't take rejection well, he plotted. Not intelligently, but obsessively. At one point, he supposedly conspired to flee to the Netherlands, join the rebellious Protestants, and raise an army against his own father. Philip responded with the tact of a man who'd finally had enough. He had Don Carlos arrested and locked in a room. For 6 months, with no human contact. Some say Philip poisoned him. Others say Don Carlos starved himself to death. Still others blame the cocktail of illnesses, infections, and untreated insanity that had been building inside him since the cradle. Regardless of the method, he died at the age of 23, alone, unwept, and entirely unfit for the throne he never actually reached. Spain mourned him publicly, but privately, the court exhaled. Don Carlos wasn't just a failed prince, he was a red-letter warning that the royal line had broken. His madness wasn't incidental, it was engineered. He was what happens when your dynasty becomes a petri dish and no one is willing to admit it smells funny. After his death, the Spanish monarchy got even more paranoid. Future heirs were groomed more carefully, though not differently. Because, as disturbing as Don Carlos was, the solution wasn't to change the breeding strategy. No, the solution was to hide the results better. And speaking of hidden royal dysfunctions, let's hop over to Northern Europe, where things were quieter, colder, and no less inbred. Our next tragic monarch? Christian VII of Denmark. A king so mentally unwell he needed a physician to rule for him, and guess what? He married his cousin too. Christian VII of Denmark. Christian VII of Denmark didn't rule a kingdom so much as wandered through it, twitching, mumbling, and occasionally throwing punches at the air. Born in 1749, crowned in 1766, and mentally checked out by 1767, Christian was less a monarch and more a prolonged medical episode. A cautionary tale in silk and ermine, he was yet another royal testament to what happens when generations of blue blood circle the same shallow genetic drain. Let's begin at the beginning, because that's where things were already off. Christian's parents were Frederick V of Denmark and Louise of Great Britain, who, naturally, were first cousins once removed. Not too scandalous by European royal standards after all, mild inbreeding was considered downright fashionable in the 18th century. But even this seemingly modest level of consanguinity carried the same risks: neurological disorders, emotional instability, and a remarkable ability to unravel under pressure. As a child, Christian showed early signs of trouble. He was jittery, easily distracted, prone to violent outbursts and depressive spirals. He laughed at funerals. He cried during dances. He developed a nervous tic that made him lurch like a marionette with one string cut. His tutors quickly realized that teaching him anything beyond how to hold a fork was a lost cause. One of them, likely desperate and sleep-deprived, simply declared him absolutely incorrigible. Still, he was the heir. So, like any heir in desperate need of adult supervision, Christian was hastily married at age 17 to Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, his first cousin, because of course he was. The marriage was doomed before the ink dried on the family tree. Caroline Matilda was smart, poised, and by the standards of royal brides, shockingly emotionally literate, which made her entirely incompatible with a husband who spent most of his time self-harming, insulting courtiers, and skipping meetings to chase imaginary insects. On their wedding night, Christian reportedly spent more time performing acrobatics and making crude jokes than doing anything remotely marital. When pressed on why he wasn't interested in his new wife, he allegedly shrugged and said he preferred prostitutes. They don't talk so much. Despite the chaos, Caroline Matilda bore him a son, the future Frederick VI. Whether or not Christian had much to do with that moment of functionality is still debated by historians and anyone with a passing interest in probability. Because soon after, the king spiraled fully and violently out of reach. He would attack servants without warning. He developed a fixation with masturbating compulsively in public spaces, a habit that didn't exactly help his approval ratings. He had full-blown hallucinations and became obsessed with bodily functions, announcing them to courtiers like royal proclamations. One account describes him slapping himself repeatedly during formal dinners while giggling uncontrollably. Another describes him refusing to bathe for weeks, claiming soap was a Jesuit conspiracy. By age 19, he was functionally incapacitated. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician hired to keep Christian from completely unraveling. Instead, Struensee took over. The doctor became the de facto ruler of Denmark. He issued progressive reforms, slashed censorship, modernized laws, and just for extra scandal began an affair with Queen Caroline Matilda. It was less a love triangle and more a bureaucratic coup. The king, meanwhile, continued muttering in the corner, barely aware he was being puppeted like a forgotten stage prop. Eventually, the Danish court had enough. In 1772, a palace coup overthrew Struensee, exiled the queen, and tightened the leash around Christian. He would live another 29 years quiet, sedated, and utterly powerless. A king in name, a medical exhibit in practice. Christian VII's reign was a masterclass in hereditary failure, not just because of his mental illness, but because of how completely everyone ignored it in favor of maintaining dynastic appearances. No one wanted to admit the king wasn't fit to rule, not because they didn't know, but because it was impolite to say so. And yet, for all his dysfunction, Christian was hardly unique. Across the Mediterranean, another royal family was performing the same genetic experiments, but this time with more eyeliner and pharaonic flair. The Ptolemies weren't just inbred, they were enthusiastically inbred. And their star player? A teenage king named Ptolemy XIII who married his own sister and still couldn't hold the throne. Ptolemy XIII of Egypt. When your entire dynasty is a real-life Game of Thrones fanfic with fewer dragons and more sibling marriages, odds are you're going to end up with a Ptolemy XIII. The Ptolemaic line in Egypt wasn't just inbred, it was aggressively, theatrically, and unapologetically inbred. Not by accident, but by ideology. To rule Egypt, they believed, you had to be divine. And to be divine, you had to keep your blood as pure as Nile silt, which, in practice, meant marrying your sister and hoping the gods were into genetics. Ptolemy XIII was one of the last pathetic acts in this long-running royal farce. Born around 61 BCE, he was the son of Ptolemy XII, also known as Auletes, a nickname that translates to something like the flute player, which is only fitting for a king whose primary political strategy was breathy distractions and bribes. His children, Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII, were the result of generations of royal loop-de-loops. And just as expected, they were betrothed to each other by the time they were old enough to pronounce incest. The logic was simple. Marry your sister, rule Egypt, die mysteriously. It was practically the family crest. Ptolemy XIII became king at around 11 years old, alongside Cleopatra, who was about 17 and infinitely more competent. This joint rule was supposed to maintain Ptolemaic tradition, equal rule between royal siblings turned spouses. But there was just one small problem. Cleopatra had a brain, a backbone, and apparently no interest in playing wife to her barely pubescent husband. Awkward. The two of them quickly devolved from co-rulers to political enemies. Cleopatra refused to play the docile sibling wife. She dropped his name from official documents. She issued coins with only her face. She governed like she was planning to outlive everyone in the room. Ptolemy, meanwhile, was being puppeted by his regents, the real power behind the increasingly awkward throne. He spent most of his brief career either trying to exile Cleopatra or being manipulated into civil war. Neither option worked out great. By age 13, Ptolemy XIII had declared war on his sister wife. She was driven out of Alexandria, but she didn't stay gone. Instead, she camped outside with an army, a political plan, and, as fate would have it, Julius Caesar. Caesar, who had just arrived in Egypt with more soldiers than social graces, famously intervened after Cleopatra smuggled herself into his quarters inside a rug. What followed was a bizarre ménage à trois of sex, politics, and bloodlines. Cleopatra got Caesar. Caesar got curious. Ptolemy got absolutely wrecked. In 48 BCE, things came to a boiling point. Civil war tore through Alexandria. The young king's forces clashed with Caesar's troops in the streets. And in one of history's more cinematic humiliations, Ptolemy XIII, trying to flee across the Nile, drowned, or was pushed, or tripped over his own title. Honestly, the accounts vary. All that matters is, the boy king died at around age 15, unloved, outmaneuvered, and up to his nose in tradition. He left behind a sister wife who would go on to rule alone, seduce more powerful Romans, and eventually turn the Ptolemaic dynasty into legend. But Ptolemy XIII, he became a footnote. A genetic speed bump on Cleopatra's rise. A reminder that when you marry your sister and declare war before your voice finishes changing, things rarely end well. Still, one has to marvel at the sheer stubbornness of the Ptolemaic dynasty. They didn't just dabble in inbreeding, they ritualized it. And they weren't done yet. Because Cleopatra wasn't finished playing house with her brothers. After Ptolemy XIII's watery exit, she married another one, Ptolemy XIV. Because nothing says political stability like switching out your child husband for your slightly younger child husband and hoping the empire doesn't notice. Cleopatra VII. You know her as Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, seductress of Rome, eyeliner icon. But before she was a myth draped in gold and cinematic tragedy, she was something much more complicated, the living product of nearly 3 centuries of royal sibling marriage. If you're looking for the most glamorous cautionary tale in the long, sweaty history of inbreeding, Cleopatra VII is it. She wasn't just inbred, she was the last inbred. The final flare of a dynasty that had long since collapsed into its own reflection. Born in 69 BCE to Ptolemy XII and, well, probably his sister or cousin, because Ptolemaic parentage is less a fact and more a cursed logic puzzle, Cleopatra entered the world already destined for incestuous greatness. Her ancestors, all descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, had been marrying their siblings since the 3rd century BCE. That wasn't a quirk. That was policy. A pharaoh didn't just marry his sister, he had to. It was how you made sure your blood stayed divine and your political enemies stayed family. Cleopatra wasn't the exception. She was the culmination. At age 18, she co-ruled with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, who also happened to be her husband. Because of course he was. He was about 10 at the time. Imagine your average middle school boy. Now imagine being legally married to him and expected to rule a fracturing empire together. Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, did what any smart royal would do in her situation. she slowly shoved her child husband out of the way. And when Ptolemy XIII tried to shove back, civil war, betrayal, bodies in the river. You know, typical honeymoon. Cleopatra was smarter than everyone expected her to be, fluent in multiple languages, politically astute, charmingly ruthless. But she was also stuck in a dynasty where keeping power meant keeping your genes in the family. After her first brother, husband drowned, likely helped along by Roman spears and bad choices, she married Ptolemy XIV, her younger brother. He was about 12. She was now 22 and firmly in control. The marriage, as you might imagine, was ceremonial in the worst way. There's no evidence they shared a bed, just a throne and a very awkward breakfast table. But Cleopatra had already figured out that Egypt's future didn't lie with her inbred siblings, it lay with Rome. Enter Julius Caesar, older, wiser, more powerful, less related. For Cleopatra, he was everything her dynastic husbands were not: capable, charismatic. Completely unbothered by the incestuous weight of her lineage, their alliance was instant and deeply strategic. He helped her reclaim the throne, and she gave him a child, Caesarion, also known as Ptolemy XV. Yes, another Ptolemy. Cleopatra didn't stop the naming tradition, even if she was finally breaking out of the genetic loop. She ruled with Caesarion for a time, but kept Ptolemy XIV around until he mysteriously died at age 15. Poisoned, most historians believe, because Cleopatra didn't just play the game, she won it. And then she quietly swept the extra players off the board. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra pivoted to Mark Antony, another Roman power broker with a thing for royalty and poor life choices. With him, she had 3 more children. None of them would survive the political fallout of their parents' defeat at the hands of Octavian, the future Augustus. Cleopatra and Antony died in theatrical style. He by falling on his sword, she allegedly by snakebite, though frankly, overdosing on irony seems more likely. Cleopatra's death marked the end of both the Ptolemaic dynasty and the official reign of sibling marriage as state policy. Egypt became a Roman province, Caesarion was hunted down and killed, and the ancient tradition of keeping the throne within one genetically claustrophobic household finally died with her. And yet, she remains unforgettable. History turned her into a legend, focusing on her lovers, her power, her dramatic death, but conveniently glossing over the fact that for much of her life, she was technically married to her brothers. Not once, but twice. Still, if Cleopatra's story is the glamour of inbreeding, our next monarch is the gloom. Because across the Atlantic, another empire also believed in keeping it all in the family, only they cloaked it in divine titles and gold-plated ritual. Meet Atahualpa, the last true emperor of the Inca, who ruled with his sister wife by his side and a destiny that came with a sword to the neck. Atahualpa. In the Andes, high above the choking grip of European courts and cousin marriages, the Inca Empire perfected its own brand of dynastic purity, one no less committed to bloodline obsession than the Habsburgs, the Ptolemies, or the Bourbons. Their difference? They called it divinity, not dysfunction. And standing at the end of this gold-paved lineage was Atahualpa, the last sovereign emperor of the Inca and the proud husband of his full sister. Yes, full sister. Not half, not distant, not some cushy cousin with a different middle name. A shared womb, shared parents, shared everything. Because to the Inca, royalty wasn't just sacred, it was literally god-blooded. The Sapa Inca was the son of Inti, the sun god, and his sister wife, the Koya, was the daughter of the moon. Marriage between siblings wasn't a scandal, It was cosmic necessity. You ruled together as celestial equals, or not at all. So when Atahualpa ascended the throne, already flushed with divine entitlement, it was only fitting that he married his sister, likely a woman named Koya Asarpe. She was both queen and symbolic counterpart, the lunar mirror to his solar reign. Together, they embodied the balance of heaven and earth. And also, unfortunately, an increasingly brittle genetic loop that the Incas had been maintaining for generations. Unlike the frail monarchs of European inbreeding, Atahualpa didn't twitch or stammer. He didn't mutter at dinners or chase imaginary birds. By most accounts, he was healthy, charismatic, and terrifyingly confident. But make no mistake, the warning signs were there. Atahualpa's belief in his own untouchable divinity would cost him everything. Let's rewind. Atahualpa wasn't even supposed to rule. He was the son of Huayna Capac, the previous emperor, and one of his secondary wives. The original heir was his half-brother Huáscar, the legitimate son of the principal queen. But when Huayna Capac died, likely of smallpox brought ahead of the Europeans like a morbid calling card, he split his empire. Huáscar got Cusco, the traditional capital. Atahualpa got Quito, the newer northern stronghold. This worked about as well as joint custody in a civil war. Huáscar demanded total loyalty. Atahualpa refused. What followed was a vicious fraternal war that tore the Inca Empire apart. Atahualpa, with his superior generals and raw ambition, crushed his brother's forces. Huáscar was captured, humiliated, and paraded like a sad trophy. Atahualpa emerged triumphant, striding into the ruins of a fractured kingdom with all the swagger of a man who thought the gods were on speed dial. And then came Francisco Pizarro. If Atahualpa was born from the sun, Pizarro was born from a foggy Iberian alleyway full of mercenaries and pious greed. He arrived in Peru in 1532 with fewer than 200 men, most of whom couldn't spell empire if you spotted them the vowels. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in steel, guns, horses, and the brutal efficiency of colonial ambition. Atahualpa, unaware that he was dealing with a different kind of predator, agreed to meet Pizarro at Cajamarca. He brought 6,000 unarmed retainers. The Spaniards brought cannons. It was not a fair fight. The massacre was swift and one-sided. Atahualpa was captured and held for ransom. To secure his release, he promised to fill a room with gold and 2 with silver. The Incas, ever loyal, delivered. The Spaniards, ever European, executed him anyway. In 1533, Atahualpa was garroted, strangled by a wooden cord, and the Inca Empire began its long descent into colonial subjugation. His sister wife, like the empire she symbolized, vanished quietly from the historical record. But here's the irony. Atahualpa wasn't defeated because he married his sister. He was defeated because he believed the system that made him could protect him. Like all inbred monarchs before and after, he mistook bloodline for invincibility. He thought his divine lineage made him untouchable. Instead, it made him predictable. The Incas had gold. The Spaniards had guns, but they both shared one fatal flaw, an unwavering belief that royal purity guaranteed power. And speaking of dangerous beliefs, let's swing back to Europe, where a man once called the Sunday King was preparing to shine his glorious light on the world by marrying his cousin and starting a dynasty that would carry the Habsburg blood into France. His name was Louis XIV. His mistake? Thinking light could purify what centuries of inbreeding had already dimmed. Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV, the self-styled Sunday King, didn't just rule France, he performed France. Every gesture was choreographed, every glance calculated, every bowel movement scheduled for maximum audience. He was monarchy as theater, kinghood as performance art, and Versailles was his glittering stage, and like any well-funded production, the casting was crucial. So when it came time to choose a queen, he looked out over the vast tapestry of European nobility, surveyed the strategic possibilities, considered the long-term diplomatic impacts, and married his first cousin. Of course he did. Her name was Maria Theresa of Spain, daughter of Philip IV, and Mariana of Austria, who were uncle and niece, if you recall. So yes, that made Maria Theresa and Louis not only first cousins, but proud inheritors of two family trees that had been squinting at each other from across a battlefield of shared chromosomes. The Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties were now fused in marital harmony and genetic redundancy. But to Louis, this wasn't an era, it was a triumph. The marriage was intended as a grand gesture of peace following the 30 Years' War, a dynastic merger that would solidify relations between France and Spain. In reality, it was a genealogical time bomb wrapped in lace and powdered wigs. Maria Theresa brought with her the full weight of Habsburg inheritance. Physically, she carried the trademarks, the famously pronounced jaw, a tendency toward delicate health, and that vacant, melancholic expression so often captured in royal portraits where the sitter is either contemplating eternity or trying not to drool. Politically, she came with a dowry that was never paid and a claim to the Spanish throne that would later explode into a continent-wide war. But Louis didn't marry her for love or beauty or intellectual stimulation. He married her for the optics. She was pious, submissive, and most importantly, had the right pedigree. Their wedding was a high-gloss spectacle, all gold brocade and imported incense, with the young king dazzling in his finery and the bride quietly dying inside beneath a veil of expectations. Their relationship was, in a word, imbalanced. While Maria Theresa fulfilled her queenly duties producing 6 children and quietly ignoring her husband's increasingly public infidelities, Louis XIV was writing the playbook on royal adultery. Mistresses weren't just tolerated at court. They were expected, celebrated, installed in gilded apartments with their own budget lines. Madame de Montespan, Madame de Maintenon. The list goes on. Maria Theresa, meanwhile, stood in the background like a tired stage prop, occasionally wheeled out for baptisms and state dinners. And yet, despite all the humiliation, she remained devoted. Her letters to Louis are filled with affection, reverence, and a sort of exhausted faith. She believed in the monarchy, in her role, in her husband's divine right, despite all evidence that the divine had clearly taken a sabbatical. Louis, for his part, spoke kindly of her in public but rarely sought her out in private. When she died in 1683, he was said to have muttered, "This is the first trouble she's given me." A line so cold it could have frozen the fountains of Versailles. It was the perfect summary of their marriage, politically convenient, genetically doomed, emotionally vacant. And yet, their bloodline endured. Their son, the Grand Dauphin, would go on to pass his compromised genetics down the royal staircase, eventually resulting in Louis XVI, the final tragic king of France, whose marriage to another inbred Habsburg would end at the guillotine. Louis XIV's union with Maria Theresa wasn't a love story. It was a dynasty breathing heavily into its own mirror, a peace treaty dressed in white, sealed with the future misfortunes of half of Europe. But Maria Theresa herself wasn't just a vehicle for awkward diplomacy. She was a woman, a queen, and an embodiment of everything the Habsburg legacy had been breeding toward: devotion without voice, duty without autonomy, and a body carrying the fragile remains of an empire. So, let's give her the moment Louis never did. Let's meet Maria Theresa of Spain, whose jawline told the entire story before she ever opened her mouth. Maria Theresa of Spain. Maria Theresa of Spain was born into the thick of it. Thick royal blood, thick religious dogma, thick political expectations, and, most conspicuously, the thick jawline of the Spanish Habsburgs. A genetic inheritance sculpted by centuries of royal marriages so insular, they made Tupperware look porous. By the time she was born in 1638 to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, his niece, if you need the refresher, Maria Theresa was less a child than a dynastic inevitability. Her pedigree was impeccable, if by impeccable you mean overly repeated. Her father was both her father and her cousin's cousin. Her mother was her cousin and her aunt. Her future husband, first cousin. It was all so neat and tragic, like a family tree fed through a garbage disposal and pressed into a crown. As a princess, Maria Theresa's life was spent in cloisters and courtrooms, part royal, part relic. She was trained to be pious, obedient, and decorative, the holy trinity of Habsburg womanhood. From childhood, her world was a rehearsal for one role, queen consort. She didn't write plays or raise armies, or even debate court policy. Her job was to look serene and carry the bloodline forward like a loyal vessel, preferably without dying in the process. Her future was decided not by her character, but by treaties. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 was brokered to end the war between France and Spain, and the deal came with a condition. Maria Theresa would marry Louis XIV of France, her cousin and future sun god. She was 21. He was 20. And from the moment she crossed the Pyrenees, she ceased being Spanish. She was now French property. But France wasn't kind to her. From the beginning, she was seen as foreign, solemn, and overly devout. She carried the Habsburg stiffness into the velvet world of Versailles, where sin was scented with rosewater and flirtation was a professional skill. She wasn't witty, she didn't gamble, she didn't indulge. She prayed, constantly. She gave birth, repeatedly. She lost children, often. And through it all, she stood beside a man who radiated golden infidelity like sunlight. Louis XIV had mistresses like other men had hobbies, not secret affairs, but full-blown public romances with titles, influence, children, and diplomatic consequences. While Maria Theresa watched her own sons die, one by one, 6 children born. Only one reaching adulthood, Louis populated the court with bastards who would eventually shape the future of France more than her legitimate heirs ever could. Still, Maria Theresa never publicly complained. She wept in private, attended Mass with industrial intensity, and clung to her duty like it was the last thing keeping her alive. Maybe it was, because beneath the pearls and embroidered robes was a body crumbling quietly under the weight of its inherited fragility. The Habsburg legacy wasn't just about power, it was about internal collapse. Her health deteriorated slowly, then all at once. She died in 1683 at the age of 44. Infection, exhaustion, grief, it's hard to say what truly killed her. Most likely, it was all of it, wrapped in the same silence she wore her entire life. Louis didn't rush to her bedside. He didn't grieve loudly. And his famous quote, "This is the first trouble she's given me," was less a eulogy than an accidental confession. He had married a ghost and never noticed. Maria Theresa never wielded power. She never led armies or issued decrees. But she embodied a dynasty's decay with grace, so quiet it almost passed unnoticed. She was the worn-down endpoint of a genetic experiment disguised as divine rule, a woman built from centuries of careful cousin selections, handed to a man who wanted a queen, not a person. But this story isn't finished yet. because Maria Theresa wasn't the only Habsburg Maria who kept the inbreeding party going. There was another, a woman who ruled more directly, bred more extensively, and married her cousin just as proudly. She was called Empress. Her name? Maria Theresa of Austria. And her children would be scattered across Europe like cursed seeds. Archduchess Maria Theresa of Austria. Archduchess Maria Theresa of Austria was the kind of ruler who makes history teachers salivate. She was bold, political, relentless, maternal, Catholic, and because this is still a story about royal inbreeding, married her first cousin, naturally. Because for all her reforms, declarations, and empress-level ambition, she was still a Habsburg. And Habsburgs had one inviolable rule: no gene left behind. Born in 1717, Maria Theresa came into the world as the eldest daughter of Emperor Charles VI, a man so desperate to keep the Habsburg line going that he rewrote succession laws just to give her a chance. The Pragmatic Sanction declared that she could inherit his empire even though, according to tradition, women weren't supposed to rule. But Charles VI had a problem: no sons. So he spent most of his reign begging European powers to accept his daughter's future rule, promising them alliances, dowries, and a steady supply of cousine marriage treaties. Spoiler: the moment he died, they ignored all of it. In 1740, when Maria Theresa ascended the throne at age 23, half of Europe pounced like in-laws at a contested will. What followed was the War of the Austrian Succession, a polite title for 8 years of chaos involving Prussia, France, Spain, and a generous helping of betrayals. Maria Theresa, to her credit, didn't flinch. She donned mourning black, clutched her newborn child, and stood before the Hungarian nobility begging for troops like a widowed lioness. And they gave them to her, because despite being a woman, she had the one trait that mattered more than gender: Habsburg blood. But while her empire was bleeding on battlefields, her womb was working overtime. Maria Theresa gave birth to 16 children, of whom 11 survived into adulthood, a number so high by Habsburg standards that it almost qualified as suspicious. Among them were Marie Antoinette, Joseph II, and Leopold II, names that would, for better or worse, come to define the latter part of Europe's inbred monarchic twilight. Her husband, Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, was not exactly an alpha male. He was her first cousin, of course, through both Habsburg and Lorraine lines. Their union was described as affectionate, but also strange. She ran the empire while he ran the treasury into the ground. Still, they produced heirs like it was a state duty, which, for Maria Theresa, it absolutely was. Each child was a pawn, a potential alliance, a future crown. She married them off across Europe with the same zeal other rulers applied to military campaigns. But the genetic math wasn't improving. Many of her children exhibited the telltale signs of intergenerational genetic bottlenecking: weak chins, delicate health, strange emotional fragilities. Her son, Joseph II, despite being highly intelligent and reform-minded, suffered from chronic neuroses and an inability to connect with, well, people. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, married off to another cousin king, would meet her fate in revolutionary France, the blood on her guillotine blade, arguably born of more than just bad cake metaphors. Maria Theresa herself was no stranger to contradictions. She banned torture, improved education, and championed vaccination, but also reinforced censorship, upheld rigid religious laws, and never once questioned the Habsburg marital blueprint. She ruled like a lion, reformed like a saint, and bred like a farmer, trying to keep the royal cattle line pure. because for all her progress, she still believed in the divine sanctity of Habsburg flesh. And yet, her empire endured. Somehow, the Austro-Hungarian patchwork she held together with bureaucratic grit and maternal sacrifice remained mostly intact through her reign, but the cracks were spreading. When Maria Theresa died in 1780, she was buried in the Habsburg crypt beneath Vienna beside her cousin husband, surrounded by the bones of centuries of similarly entangled relatives. Her tomb bears Latin inscriptions, imperial flourishes, and not a single warning about inbreeding. But perhaps her greatest legacy isn't just the empire she ruled, it's the empire she bred. Because among those 16 children was a line that would reach across borders and decades to produce monarchs of Spain, France, Naples, and Mexico. One of them? A king born from this exact mixture of Bourbon and Habsburg bloodlines, a boy destined to inherit the compounded DNA of empires. His name was King Alfonso XII of Spain, and his pedigree reads like a confession. King Alfonso XII of Spain. By the time King Alfonso XII was born in 1857, his family tree had so many crossed branches it looked less like a tree and more like a ceremonial hairball. He wasn't just royal, he was the distilled product of centuries of tightly controlled inbreeding across the Bourbon and Habsburg bloodlines, brought together like two collapsing stars in a gravitational death spiral. If you mapped out his ancestry, you'd find yourself circling the same handful of names like a haunted genealogy merry-go-round. Alfonso XII was the son of Queen Isabella II of Spain. You'll remember her from the double first-cousin marriage just a few segments ago in Francisco de Assis, her lace-wearing, lace-fearing husband and, yes, double first cousin. But there's a twist. Alfonso may not have actually been Francisco's biological child. His paternity remains one of the more popular whispers in the footnotes of European history. The short version? Alfonso may have been the son of Enrique Puigmolto, a handsome army officer with a pulse, a jawline, and allegedly access to the Queen's bedroom. But here's the irony. Even if he wasn't Francisco's son, he was still inbred. Because Puigmolto wasn't some peasant, he was also a noble and also related. In 19th century Spain, even your mistress's side piece was probably a cousin. It was genetic inevitability wearing a military uniform. Regardless of his origins, Alfonso XII was raised with all the baggage of Bourbon Spain. Political unrest, civil war, and the collective sigh of a country tired of monarchs who ruled with their chins instead of their brains. His mother, Isabella II, had been deposed in 1868 during the Glorious Revolution and fled into exile with her scandal-stained court. The monarchy was briefly replaced with a failed experiment in constitutional monarchy featuring a king borrowed from Italy, no less. Then a republic, then more military coups, until finally, after enough chaos to make the French Revolution look like an awkward picnic, Spain decided to hit the royal reset button. Enter Alfonso XII. Young, good-looking, and more importantly, not his mother. He was brought back to Spain in 1874 and crowned king at just 17, sold to the public as a modern, moderate, monarchic do-over. They called him the Pacificator because he walked into a country that had been punching itself in the face for decades and, for a brief moment, got it to stop. But underneath the polished surface of this fresh-faced king was the same old royal rot. His genes were still soaked in generations of Habsburg and Bourbon repetition. And while he wasn't deformed or overtly unstable like his great-uncle Charles II, the signs were still there. He was frequently ill, chronically overworked, and surrounded by advisors who understood the importance of maintaining royal appearances at all costs, even if the blood beneath the crown was more museum exhibit than lifeblood. Alfonso's reign was short, and by Spanish standards almost shockingly competent. He worked to restore political stability, pushed for moderation between conservatives and liberals, and tried to keep Spain from disintegrating entirely. He was even charming, which in Bourbon terms might as well have been a miracle. But the family curse never misses a target. He died young, just 27, of tuberculosis, a disease made all the more lethal by a weakened immune system that may very well have been a hereditary gift from his interconnected forebears. He left behind a pregnant widow, Maria Christina of Austria, because of course he married another Habsburg, and an unborn son who would become Alfonso XIII, the next genetically preloaded monarch in the Spanish chain of royal mayhem. Alfonso XII's legacy is paradoxical. He was one of the better Bourbon kings, thoughtful, reform-minded, sympathetic, but his blood was still a minefield. His mother was his cousin, his wife was his cousin, and his posthumous son would carry the full weight of that genetic cocktail into the 20th century. Because in the House of Bourbon, a short reign doesn't mean a clean slate. It just means the next chapter is already in the womb, waiting, twitching, and probably drooling. And speaking of bloodlines that didn't stay buried, let's now return to the empire's colonial experiment in royal cosplay. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico, an Austrian Habsburg, dropped into the New World like a bad idea with epaulets. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. If royal inbreeding were a global export, Maximilian I of Mexico was the deluxe European shipment, gift-wrapped in idealism and buried under half a millennium of Habsburg dysfunction. Imagine being so confident in your family's genetic superiority that you agree to become the emperor of a country that didn't ask for one across an ocean, on another continent, in the middle of a civil war, and then being surprised when it ends in front of a firing squad. Maximilian was born in 1832-inch Vienna into the famously over-recycled gene pool of the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. His parents were Archduke Franz Karl of Austria and Princess Sophie of Bavaria, which means, yes, there were more cousin branches than oak leaves in his family tree. His great-great-grandparents? Often the same people on both sides. His medical chart? A slow-moving tragedy of migraines, mood swings, and according to some sources, a touch of syphilitic irony, though that last bit might just be court gossip with a poetic twist. As a child, Maximilian was sensitive, artistic, bookish, the kind of boy who collects butterflies and writes essays about feelings, while his older brother Franz Joseph is busy preparing to become Emperor of Austria-Hungary, which he did. Maximilian, meanwhile, was handed Naples and then stripped of it, sent off to administer the Austrian navy, and then promptly passed over for anything requiring a steady hand. He wanted to be Voltaire with cheekbones. His family wanted him out of the way. Enter Napoleon III of France, a man whose ambitions were larger than his understanding of foreign cultures. In the 1862nd, with the U.S. distracted by its own civil war, Napoleon cooked up a plan to establish a puppet monarchy in Mexico, ostensibly to protect European investments, but more honestly to show off. What he needed was a noble-born European with enough pedigree to look legitimate and enough naivete to take the job. Maximilian ticked both boxes with Habsburg precision. In 1864, Maximilian landed in Veracruz with his wife, Carlota of Belgium, and an entourage that looked more like a Viennese opera company than a political team. He declared himself Emperor of Mexico by invitation of the Mexican conservatives, though conveniently ignoring that the country already had a president, Benito Juarez, who had no intention of handing over the keys. Maximilian tried to rule with liberal principles: land reform, education, compromise. But it was hard to pass progressive laws when most of your support came from monarchists and clergy who wanted the 17th century back. Worse still, he was a Habsburg draped in silk, full of noble ideals, but tragically disconnected from reality. The Mexican people were skeptical, the liberals were furious. And the United States, having wrapped up its Civil War, reminded Napoleon III that the Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a decorative wall, quote. When France pooled its military support in 1866, Maximilian was left with a hollow crown, a dwindling army, and a wife who, after failing to rally European help, had a nervous breakdown in Rome and spent the rest of her life believing she was still empress. Maximilian stayed behind, convinced he could still save the country. He could not. He was captured by Republican forces in 1867 and executed by firing squad on a bright June morning. His last words were allegedly dignified, noble, and romantic because of course they were. He died with a straight spine and a full beard, as if that could make up for 3 years of catastrophic miscalculation. But what makes Maximilian especially tragic isn't just his political naivete. It's how entirely predictable his downfall was. He was born into a family where bloodlines mattered more than common sense, handed a throne he didn't earn, and dropped into a country he didn't understand. And because he was a Habsburg, he believed deeply that he was meant to be there. That divinity flowed through his veins, that his last name was enough. It wasn't. And yet, the dynasty kept going. Back in Austria, other branches of the Habsburg family continued the tradition of royal disappointment. One child in particular, born into this same doomed bloodline, would one day pull the trigger not on a revolution, but on himself. Prince Rudolph of Austria, Maximilian's nephew, and perhaps the saddest heir of them all, Prince Rudolph of Austria. Prince Rudolph of Austria was born in 1858 with a silver spoon in his mouth, a golden crown over his crib, and a loaded pistol waiting patiently at the end of his bloodline. The only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth of Bavaria, yes. Another glorious Habsburg-Bavarian merger between cousins several times over Rudolph was supposed to be the future of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Instead, he became its foreshadowing. From the beginning, he didn't fit the mold. The Habsburgs were famous for their rigid discipline, their devout Catholicism, their unwavering belief in titles and order and in breeding as a sacred ritual. Rudolph? He read Darwin. He wrote liberal pamphlets. He hated the military drills, despised the church's grip on education, and once told his tutors that if God made the Habsburgs divine rulers, then God needed a refresher on biology. Not the family favorite, in case that wasn't obvious. His father, Franz Joseph, was an austere workaholic who believed emotions were for peasants and schedules were divine law. His mother, the legendary Empress Sissi, was famously beautiful, famously miserable, and frequently absent either on long rides across Hungary or avoiding the Viennese court like it had the plague, which, metaphorically speaking, it did. So Rudolph was raised by tutors who were more drill sergeants than mentors. His emotional needs were politely ignored, his intellectual curiosity was treated as rebellion, and his growing physical ailments, migraines, depression, insomnia were dismissed as aristocratic moodiness. It didn't help that his Habsburg heritage came with a grab bag of hereditary issues, neurological instability, autoimmune disorders, brittle temperament, and of course, the family's favorite feature, crushing loneliness disguised as divine authority. By the time he was a teenager, Rudolph was writing essays about suicide. But the empire needed heirs, not poets, so the court arranged a politically strategic marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, his cousin naturally. The match was cold, strained, and awkward. Rudolph, already emotionally damaged and psychologically fragile, turned to affairs, morphine, and political radicalism. He joined liberal intellectual circles in secret. He debated workers' rights in private letters. Publicly, he was a prince. Privately, he was unraveling. The pressure of succession didn't help. His father increasingly saw him as a disappointment, a son who questioned too much and obeyed too little. The weight of being the heir to a dying empire, built on outdated aristocracy and patchwork alliances, settled into Rudolph's bones like frost. He wasn't just living in the shadow of Franz Joseph. He was living under the weight of a crumbling world order, with his own name etched in at the very top. Then came Baroness Mary Vetsera, a 17-year-old noblewoman who became Rudolph's companion, obsession, and tragic mirror. Their relationship was secret, scandalous, and doomed. In January 1889, the two retreated to the Mayerling hunting lodge, where everything collapsed. No one knows exactly what happened. What's widely accepted is this. On the 30th of January, Prince Rudolph shot Mary, then himself. Some say it was a suicide pact. Others believe it was a murder-suicide. The Habsburg court, in full damage control mode, lied, covered, sanitized, and mourned. A prince with liberal dreams and inherited nightmares had killed himself at the age of 30, and the dynasty, already staggering, suddenly looked like a ghost propped up by uniforms and incense. The Mayerling incident wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a dynastic death rattle. With Rudolph gone, the direct line of succession was shattered. The empire staggered toward World War I, increasingly rudderless, increasingly irrelevant. But the truly haunting part? Rudolph wasn't an anomaly. He was the logical conclusion of a system that refused to evolve, born from cousins, married to cousins, crushed by expectations he never believed in, and consumed by the rot he inherited. He was Habsburg royalty in its final, tragic form, overeducated, overbred, and emotionally obliterated. Still, the show went on. Because across the border in Spain, another monarch from the same mold would take the stage. His blood carried the weight of Europe's most dysfunctional family tree, and something new, hemophilia, courtesy of his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. Meet Alfonso XIII, the king born after his father's death, and one of the last true heirs to the royal gene pool's bad decisions. King Alfonso XIII of Spain. If King Alfonso XIII of Spain had been born with a user manual, the first page would have said, "Do not shake genetic instability inside." The last Spanish monarch born under the old dynastic model of inbred legacy, Alfonso entered the world already crowned literally. His father, Alfonso XII, had died 6 months before he was born, making the infant king a prenatal monarch. Imagine gestating under pressure like that. Before he could crawl, he ruled an empire. Before he could babble, his name was stamped on currency. And before he could walk, he was already being sized up for his first portrait royal scepter optional. But what Alfonso inherited was more than a crown. He was the product of two dynasties tangled like Christmas lights, the Spanish Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs. His mother, Maria Christina of Austria, was both regent and cousin material, tying his lineage back to centuries of dynastic recycling. If that wasn't complicated enough, Alfonso also carried something new, something blood-borne and catastrophic. Hemophilia, the hereditary disease made famous by Queen Victoria's descendants. Yes, this was the moment when the Habsburg jaw met the British bleeding disorder and shook hands violently. Hemophilia doesn't forgive mistakes. It turns minor bruises into mortal threats. A stubbed toe becomes a hospital stay. And when you're a monarch expected to ride horses, parade in military gear, and shake hands like a strong man, Being unable to clot properly is less than ideal. Though Alfonso himself was not a confirmed hemophiliac, several of his children inherited the disease, and its presence in his bloodline was undeniable. His offspring, particularly his son Infante Gonzalo, paid the price for this tangled heritage, bleeding easily, dying young, and proving that royal blood isn't always thicker than water, it just leaks slower. But Alfonso XIII was more than just a walking royal blood test. He was, in his own right, one of the more energetic and complicated monarchs of the 20th century. Raised under the suffocating regency of his mother, who insisted on tradition with all the warmth of a frozen altar boy, Alfonso was schooled in etiquette, Catholicism, and how to look regal without ever blinking. By the time he came of age, he wanted to modernize, or at least look like he did. He loved fast cars, fast women, and fast retreats from responsibility. He tried to balance Spain's collapsing empire with its desire for modernization, but instead ended up with a monarchy perpetually on life support. He played both sides of the political aisle, supporting dictators one year, liberal reforms the next, and royal prerogatives throughout. It was less strategy and more improvisational monarchy. Then there was his marriage. Naturally, it was to another relative. He married Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a British princess, and you guessed it, granddaughter of Queen Victoria. In a move that seems scripted by fate and irony, Victoria Eugenie was a confirmed carrier of hemophilia. Their union produced children, and at least 2 of them suffered from the disorder. The Spanish public, already skeptical of foreign queens, didn't love watching their future kings bruise like ripe peaches. Rumors circulated, whispers multiplied. Alfonso began to distance himself from his wife, and from the increasingly inconvenient truth that the royal bloodline was literally falling apart. Politically, things didn't go much better. Spain, reeling from the loss of its last colonies, Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico was spiraling into instability. Alfonso tried to hold it together with a combination of military shows, nationalistic rhetoric, and royal charisma. None of it worked. In 1931, as Republican sentiments reached a boiling point, Alfonso left Spain without abdicating. He called it a temporary departure. The people called it what it was, exile. He would never rule again. Alfonso XIII died in 1941 Rome, largely forgotten and increasingly irrelevant. His children scattered across Europe, his wife withdrew from public life, and the Spanish monarchy went into hibernation until Franco thawed it out decades later. Alfonso's legacy was not one of conquest or brilliance. It was one of fragility, both symbolic and biological. He was the last monarch who believed the old dynasties could survive the modern world without changing. But they couldn't. The blood was too thin, too bruised, too cursed. Still, not all royals with Habsburg blood were born to rule. Some were born to fight, or at least pretend to. Take Don John of Austria, a legendary bastard son with royal DNA, a ship under his feet, and a legacy full of contradiction. Let's meet the illegitimate Habsburg who didn't need a crown to make history, just a sword, a scandal, and the right name. Don John of Austria, 1547-1578. In a family tree where most branches curled back on themselves, Don John of Austria was the rare twig that reached out in a bold new direction, illegitimately, flamboyantly, and with all the defiance of a royal bastard who knew his blood mattered more than his birth certificate. Born in 1547, he was the unacknowledged son of Emperor Charles V, himself a grandmaster of dynastic inbreeding, and a woman whose name is still debated, usually recorded as Barbara Blomberg, a Flemish commoner with good timing and, perhaps, questionable choices. From the very start, Don John's existence was a paradox, a royal who technically didn't exist, a Habsburg without a title, a prince born outside of wedlock, but inside the gene pool of Europe's most genetically entangled dynasty. In another universe, he might have been ignored, exiled, or quietly placed in a monastery. But this was 16th century Spain, and the Habsburgs, while obsessed with bloodline purity, also understood the value of a wild card. Don John was raised in secrecy, sent to monasteries and private tutors, kept just close enough to the royal circle to be useful, but never close enough to be threatening. His half-brother, Philip II of Spain, eventually recognized him unofficially and brought him into court. But it was always clear, Don John would never sit on a throne. What he could do, however, was command a fleet. And that's exactly what he did. Tall, charismatic, and radiating a kind of reckless charm that clashed violently with the dour solemnity of his Habsburg relatives, Don John embraced the only future available to an illegitimate royal in a family where nearly every cousin was already married to every other cousin. He became a soldier, a sailor, a holy war poster boy. Spain couldn't crown him, but it could put him on a ship and point him at Islam. Thus, in 1571, Don John of Austria led the Holy League fleet against the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Lepanto, one of the largest naval battles in European history, and an absolute fever dream of religious pageantry, artillery, and floating death. The battle wasn't just military, it was symbolic. The Christian world needed a victory, and they got it commanded by a bastard prince with perfect hair and just enough royal DNA to make the papal blessings stick. Don John's victory at Lepanto was mythologized almost immediately. He was hailed as a Christian savior, a second David, a chivalric throwback with a cross in one hand and a rapier in the other. He basked in the glory, wore it like a cape, and began to imagine himself as more than just a footnote. And that's where the problem started. Flush with fame and not nearly enough humility, Don John began to dream of bigger things, realms, crowns, maybe even queens. He petitioned Philip II for greater power. He asked to be made king of Tunis or Ireland or some other politically explosive territory that could only end in scandal or war. Philip, whose idea of ambition was micromanaging from a candlelit desk, was not impressed. Instead, the king sent Don John to suppress the Dutch revolt, a slow-burning rebellion that had already chewed up and spat out several Spanish generals. Don John, with more bravado than strategy, arrived in the Low Countries, expecting parades and submission. What he got was sabotage, starvation, and bureaucratic stalemates. The crown gave him little funding. The local commanders distrusted him. The Protestants hated him. And all the while, disease crept closer. He died in 1578 at age 31, likely from typhus, though poisoned food and divine punishment were both popular theories at the time. No glorious last stand, no tragic duel. Just fever, rot, and a slow fade in a foreign land. In the end, Don John of Austria was a contradiction in lace and steel. A bastard prince with the ambitions of a king, trapped in a family that valued bloodlines more than competence. And forever defined by a last name he was never allowed to truly claim. He didn't drool like Charles II or tremble like Ferdinand I. He fought. He won. He dreamed too big. And still, the dynasty outlived him. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones dabbling in cousin marriage and slow-motion genetic collapse. In Eastern Europe, a king named Sigismund III, Vasa was busy mixing politics with family ties, marrying his cousin, and trying to glue together a kingdom that was falling apart faster than his DNA. Sigismund III Vasa. Some kings are remembered for their conquests, others for their reforms. Sigismund III Vasa, on the other hand, is mostly remembered for being wildly overqualified in the field of marrying his cousin. Born in 1566 into a royal family that spanned Sweden and Poland like a passive-aggressive empire, Sigismund was the kind of monarch who couldn't quite decide which country he was ruling or how many cousins he could legally marry before someone raised an eyebrow. The answer, of course, was as many as necessary. Because royal blood, as we've learned, is less about genetics and more about maintenance. You didn't dilute it with strangers. You reinforced it with relatives. Over and over, like adding layers of glue to a cracked vase and hoping it holds long enough to impress the neighbors. Sigismund III was born to John III of Sweden and Catherine Jagiellon, a Polish princess. This made him a Vasa by name, and a Jagiellon by blood, a blend of Nordic rigidity and Slavic grandeur, polished with Catholic guilt and a touch of political overreach. From birth, his life was a European chessboard with too many bishops and not enough pawns. In 1587, Sigismund was elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, not by inheritance, but through the traditional chaos of the Polish-Lithuanian elective monarchy. The nobles wanted a pliable Catholic with royal credentials, and Sigismund looked the part. He spoke Latin, painted like a Renaissance dilettante, and could quote Aquinas while adjusting his ceremonial cape. Perfect. A few years later, in 1592, he also became King of Sweden, thanks to his father's death and the genetic convenience of already having Vasa DNA. For a brief flickering moment, Sigismund ruled both realms, Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, a union that looked amazing on paper and immediately collapsed under the weight of religious paranoia, cultural disdain, and, of course, family drama. Why? Because Sigismund was Catholic. Sweden, at this point, was aggressively Protestant. He tried to rule it from afar, issuing edicts that mostly irritated everyone and showing up for coronations with the kind of pomp that makes Protestant reformers foam at the mouth. The Swedes revolted. His uncle Charles, later Charles IX, took the throne, and Sigismund was kicked out of Sweden faster than you can say confessional incompatibility. But while his northern crown slipped, his Polish one held barely. And into this mess of split kingdoms, fractured alliances, and smoldering religious war, Sigismund did what any responsible monarch would do. He married his cousin. Specifically, he married Anna of Austria, a Habsburg archduchess and the daughter of his maternal aunt, a first-cousin match, precise and deliberate. The political motivation was obvious: align with the Habsburgs, curry favor with Catholic powers, and produce heirs who looked like family portraits had mated with a crucifix. Anna of Austria fit the part with tragic precision. She was devout, gentle, and physically fragile in that distinct Habsburg way. Her features were carved by centuries of cousin-on-cousin logistics: narrow face, thin lips, and if court whispers are to be believed, the early signs of the family's signature mandibular overachievement. She gave birth to 5 children in 7 years, only 2 of whom survived infancy. She died in 1598 at the age of 23, exhausted and unceremoniously sainted by grief-stricken courtiers. And in true dynastic form, Sigismund married her younger sister, Constance of Austria, 2 years later, because once you've married one Habsburg cousin, why not double down? With Constance, the pattern repeated. A flurry of children, most of them delicate, several of them dead within the year. Among the survivors was John II Casimir, who would later become King of Poland, yet another royal child stitched together from a genetic patchwork so tight it squeaked. Sigismund's reign was defined by almosts, almost unified kingdoms, almost religious reform, almost dynastic stability. He spent much of his time painting religious miniatures, brooding over iconography and fighting wars he couldn't quite finish. Poland loved him for his piety, tolerated him for his heritage, and eventually resented him for dragging them into dynastic conflicts with the Swedes that would last generations. He died in 1632, old, bitter, and out of crowns. His reign didn't leave a legacy of peace or prosperity. It left a collection of increasingly sickly heirs, regional resentment, and a set of portraits where the noses looked a little too familiar. Sigismund believed he was defending divine monarchy. In reality, he was defending a genetic system that was collapsing under its own sacred logic. And while the Polish nobility argued over their next elective king, across the English Channel another monarch was experimenting with royal genetics, Henry VIII, a man who famously married 6 women but couldn't outrun one very stubborn set of chromosomes. Henry VIII of England? Most kings are remembered for how they ruled. Henry VIII is remembered for who he married and how frequently: 6 wives, 2 decapitations, a religious schism, and a dramatic waistline expansion. But behind all the jokes about his libido and his rapidly rotating queens lies a subtler, more sinister story. A monarch obsessed with producing an heir and quietly tangled in the very same family web as his European cousins. Because yes, Henry VIII, the roaring Tudor lion, had a bloodline problem, not in the grotesque Habsburg jaw sort of way. His genes didn't make his children drool or stammer or collapse before their confirmations. His were subtler failures, miscarriages, stillbirths, and weak, dying heirs. The kind of royal tragedies that don't make a caricature, they make a crisis. And at the root of it all, you guessed it, the Tudor dynasty's own taste for consanguinity. Let's rewind to the beginning. Henry was born in 1491, the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. A marriage that itself was an attempt to heal the wounds of the Wars of the Roses, Tudor and York, Lancaster and Plantagenet, all blended together in a royal compromise. But even this union had its genealogical oddities. Elizabeth and Henry VII shared a common descent from Edward III, making them distant cousins. Not enough to alarm the clergy, but just enough to keep things interesting in a time when every noble had a little too much shared DNA. When Henry's older brother, Arthur, died shortly after marrying Catherine of Aragon, Henry inherited not just the throne, but the widow. The marriage between Catherine and Arthur had allegedly not been consummated, so the Pope, pressured by royal diplomats and theological acrobats, granted permission for Henry to marry his brother's wife. And that's where the genetic wheel really starts to squeak. Catherine of Aragon wasn't just Arthur's widow. She was also Henry's cousin by marriage, and a daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, who, as you may recall, were second cousins themselves. Catherine's blood was already humming with royal repetition. Marrying her was like pouring one cup of stagnant water into another and calling it a fountain. Their union produced a single surviving child, Mary I, known to history as Bloody Mary, though her real crime might have just been surviving the Habsburg cousin lottery and still getting emotionally steamrolled by the entire Reformation. Before Mary, though, there were at least 5 known miscarriages or infant deaths. Henry, desperate for a male heir, grew convinced the marriage was cursed and unnatural. He cited the biblical passage from Leviticus, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." A very convenient verse to remember 20 years in. The truth was probably more genetic than divine. The Tudors were not especially robust. Henry's own siblings didn't fare much better. And Catherine, the product of 2 inbred Spanish monarchs, may have carried recessive traits that made her pregnancies increasingly fraught. Modern speculation suggests their children may have suffered from calcensitization, a rare blood incompatibility disorder that could explain the string of fetal deaths. a cruel twist of inheritance masquerading as divine judgment. Henry's solution, of course, was to annul the marriage. The Catholic Church refused, so Henry did what any stubborn monarch would do. He invented a new church. Thus, the Church of England was born not because of theology, but because of an heir, or more specifically, the lack of one. From there, Henry tore through wives like a drunk gambler through playing cards. Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, some cousins, some strangers. All unlucky. His only legitimate son, Edward VI, was born from Jane Seymour and died young, sickly, and surrounded by whispers of Tudor frailty. Henry VIII wasn't physically malformed like Charles II of Spain. He didn't marry his niece like Philip IV. But his reign was driven by the same haunted obsession, a desperate desire to preserve a fragile dynasty through a dangerously shallow gene pool. And in the end, he failed. His children Edward, Mary, Elizabeth would all die childless. The Tudor name vanished with them, like a flame sputtering out in a sealed room. But while Henry's family line flickered and died, the wider Habsburg network raged on. And waiting in that blood-soaked web was one of its most famous and tragic daughters, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Archduchess sent to France as a symbol of unity, and remembered today as the queen who couldn't bake, couldn't rule, and couldn't escape her inherited doom. Marie Antoinette was born into a world of velvet and protocol, baptized in Catholic pageantry, and swaddled in the genetic complications of Habsburg inbreeding. Her birth in 1755 wasn't just an event, it was a calculated victory in the long game of dynastic alliance. She was the 15th child of Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, and the same cousin couple we met earlier, those paragons of productive royal inbreeding who filled the courts of Europe with dozens of politically weaponized offspring. And Marie Antoinette? She was one of their glittering exports. Shipped off to France at the age of 14, married by proxy to the French Dauphin Louis Auguste, the boy who would one day become Louis XVI, and descend, with her, into a shared vortex of opulence, dysfunction, and revolution. At first glance, Marie Antoinette didn't seem like the typical inbred monarch. She was pretty, fashionable, and endlessly sketched by court painters eager to document her evolving hairstyles, which often resembled architectural blueprints. But behind the powdered facade was the quiet reality of Habsburg heredity: fragile health, soft bone structure, poor dental formation, and what her tutors politely described as delayed mental maturity. She struggled with language acquisition and etiquette as a child, two essential tools in a world where a mispronounced greeting could start a war. Still, France didn't care. They weren't importing Marie Antoinette for her intellect. She was a living treaty, a bandage slapped across centuries of Franco-Austrian hostility. Her primary function? To produce heirs, host balls, and look like divine legitimacy in a corset. Unfortunately, her marriage was also a genetic echo chamber. Her new husband, Louis XVI, was her second cousin once removed and also descended from Habsburg lines. The match, genetically speaking, was cozy. Too cozy. When Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles, it was less of a cultural exchange and more of a formal genetic handshake between two branches of the same ancient mistake. The results were predictably tragic. For the first 7 years of their marriage, the couple failed to consummate. Entire memoirs were written speculating why. Some blamed Louis's physical awkwardness. He may have had phimosis, a painful condition that could have rendered intercourse difficult, if not impossible. Others blamed Marie Antoinette's emotional immaturity or her lack of education in matters of the bedroom. The more vicious voices, mostly courtiers with grudges and pamphleteers with ink to spill, suggested everything from sexual incompetence to deviant preferences. The real answer? Probably some combination of shyness, medical issues, and the staggering pressure of performing heterosexual royalty under the watchful eye of Europe. Eventually, the problem resolved either through surgery or divine pity, and children were born. 4 in total. Only one, Marie-Thérèse, would survive the revolution. The others were lost to illness and trauma. One died of tuberculosis, another in prison, and one simply vanished into historical conjecture. But Marie Antoinette's biggest problem wasn't her biology, it was her visibility. She became the perfect scapegoat, a foreign queen, dripping in diamonds while bread riots boiled outside the gates. Her lavish lifestyle, exaggerated, but not entirely untrue, became an easy target for a nation ready to eat the rich. They called her Madame de Fissy, the Austrian woman, and worse. The famous quote, "Let them eat cake," which she almost certainly never said, captured the public mood better than any fact could. Behind the mockery was real rot. The French monarchy was a house of cards built on bloodline arrogance and a deep belief that God would not let cousins fail. Marie Antoinette was raised on this belief. Versailles reinforced it. The guillotine destroyed it. In 1793, she followed her husband into death, head severed by revolution, legacy forever immortalized by powdered wigs and powdered bones. The Habsburg girl who married into Bourbon France died not because she was evil or stupid or extravagant, though she was occasionally all three, but because she was a product of a system that collapsed under the weight of its own. Contradictions. And yet, she wasn't the only queen who married her cousin and watched the kingdom burn. Long before her, there was another woman draped in velvet, armed with political cunning, and locked in a marital embrace with her own relative. Her name was Joanna I of Naples, and if Marie Antoinette died in public spectacle, Joanna lived and ruled in whispered scandal. Joanna I of Naples. Long before Marie Antoinette lost her head in Paris, Joanna I of Naples nearly lost her throne and her life in a Mediterranean court soaked in cousin marriages, daggers, and divine entitlement. Born in 1326 to Charles, Duke of Calabria, and Marie of Valois, Joanna emerged from the interwoven threads of Angevin and French royal lines, an aristocratic tangle that practically guaranteed she'd end up married to someone who shared at least one grandparent. And she did. At the age of 7, she was betrothed to Andrew of Hungary, her first cousin. He was the son of Charles I of Hungary, who also happened to be her great-uncle. If that sounds confusing, it's because the family tree by this point had begun to resemble a nervous breakdown in botanical form, but to the Angevins, this was governance. This was strategy. You didn't marry strangers, you married someone you could already find on your family crest. Joanna inherited the throne of Naples at the age of 15, following the death of her grandfather, King Robert. She was crowned Queen Regnant, not Queen Consort, but the actual sovereign ruler. This was controversial. To many in the male-dominated courts of Europe, the idea of a teenage girl ruling without a man's hand on the tiller was offensive, dangerous, even heretical. To solve this problem, the Neapolitan nobility pushed for her husband Andrew to be crowned king alongside her. Joanna refused. The power dynamic was clear. She had it, and Andrew didn't. He was a Hungarian prince, imported into an Italian court like a sack of unwanted flour roiled by blood, but hopelessly out of place. His courtiers were resented. His personality was unremarkable at best. The Neapolitans disliked him. Joanna, perhaps, despised him. But in cousin marriages, love is optional. Politics is not. Andrew began lobbying the Pope for joint coronation. Joanna resisted, backed by factions of Neapolitan nobles who preferred their queen unencumbered by Hungarian interference. Tensions boiled, the court split. The whispers turned to rumors, and the rumors turned into knives. In 1345, Andrew was murdered. Strangled with a cord and tossed from a window while on a hunting trip. His body was found in the courtyard, broken and conspicuously unmissed. It was the kind of thing you couldn't prove Joanna planned, but also couldn't quite believe she didn't. The fallout was swift. Hungary was outraged. Andrew's brother, Louis I of Hungary, invaded Naples with an army, proclaiming himself the avenger of royal blood. Joanna fled the kingdom. She sought refuge in Provence, then traveled to Avignon, where she pleaded her case before the Pope. Her defense? She had nothing to do with the murder. It was palace intrigue. Local nobles. A bad night. She was innocent, or at least not officially guilty. Miraculously, she was acquitted. And, perhaps more miraculously, she got her throne back. She returned to Naples, re-established control, and resumed her reign like nothing had happened. But the shadow of Andrew's death never fully lifted, nor did her dependence on cousin marriages. Joanna married 3 more times, each union politically motivated and genetically familiar. Her second husband, Louis of Taranto, was a cousin from a different branch of the Angevins. Her third husband, James IV of Majorca, was related through Iberian royal lines. And her fourth and final husband, Otto of Brunswick, was, by Joanna's standards, a wild pick, only distantly related and, somehow, not dead by the end of it. Her reign, though long and periodically stable, was marked by constant threats. From within her court, from Hungary, from the papacy, and eventually from Charles of Durazzo, another cousin, obviously, who eventually invaded Naples and captured Joanna in 1381. She was imprisoned, strangled, just like Andrew. There's symmetry in that ugly, ironic symmetry. The queen who may have murdered her cousin husband was ultimately murdered by her cousin usurper. The House of Anjou collapsed inward, just like its DNA. But Joanna's story doesn't end with her murder. It continues in the dynasties that inherited her strategy. Marry close, rule harder, and die faster. And in that spirit, we turn to another Habsburg princess with a fate written in blood, Mariana of Spain, who married her own uncle and gave birth to the ticking time bomb of Austrian inbreeding. Mariana of Spain. Mariana of Spain was born into a royal family so inbred it's a miracle her christening didn't include a disclaimer. Born in 1606 to Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, she was the daughter of a first cousin and a second cousin. Raised in a dynasty where ancestry wasn't just documented, it was looped like a royal infinity symbol. Her parents shared more DNA than a pair of identical twins separated by time and Catholicism. And naturally, Mariana's future would be shaped by that same sacred family policy. Never marry outside the bloodline. Ever. So, when the time came to arrange her marriage, the Habsburgs did not ask, who would make a good match politically, or who might bring a new skill set to the dynasty? Number. They asked, which uncle is single? The answer. Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Her paternal uncle. Yes, that's correct. She married her father's younger brother, which made him her uncle, her husband, her cousin on multiple lines, and the father of her children. It was less a marriage and more a genetic experiment with a wedding cake. But this was the Habsburg dynasty, and marrying your uncle wasn't frowned upon, it was strategic. This wasn't taboo. This was protocol. The family believed that only by keeping the bloodline pure, that is to say, exactly the same, could divine right and imperial continuity be preserved. So Maria Ana, born a Spanish infanta, was shipped off to Vienna in 1631 to take her vows with Uncle Ferdinand and begin her new life as empress, niece, and human petri dish. The union was described by contemporaries as harmonious, which is a generous way of saying neither of them screamed. Maria Ana was intelligent, reserved, deeply devout, and politically savvy. She played her role flawlessly, hosting diplomatic receptions, managing her court with rigid Catholic decorum, and producing children like a queen on a deadline. Altogether, she gave birth to 6 children. Only a handful survived to adulthood. And among those survivors, the effects of Habsburg inbreeding were beginning to shine through, not in grotesque deformities necessarily, but in quieter, more insidious ways: emotional instability, chronic illness, developmental delays, the kind of hereditary whispers that accumulate generation after generation until the bloodline eventually speaks in full, incomprehensible sentences. Take her son Leopold I, for example, yet another Habsburg emperor born from cousin soup. Leopold was bright, musically gifted, devoutly religious, and very much in line with the family's long-standing visual theme: protruding jaw, narrow skull, eyes slightly too far apart. He would go on to marry 3 times. 2 of those wives were his cousins, and produce even more genetically experimental children, continuing the Habsburg tradition of ruling while slowly decaying from within. But back to Maria Ana. Despite her position as empress, she was never the center of European attention. She was background royalty, always important, always present, but never the subject of fascination. That role would be left to her great-great-grandson Charles II of Spain, the final and most infamous product of this tangled family tree. Maria Ana's DNA would live on in him, distilled, intensified, and mutated until it could no longer hold up the weight of a crown. Maria Ana died in 1646, aged 40, after complications from childbirth. Her death was mourned as a personal loss for Ferdinand, but it was also quietly recognized as another reminder of what this family structure could do to a woman: elevate her, use her, and ultimately destroy her from the inside. She wasn't murdered. She wasn't scandalized. She was simply consumed by expectations, by tradition, and by the very blood that made her royal. The Habsburgs never saw it that way, of course. For them, Mariana was a success. She did her duty, married the right relative, died, producing heirs. She was what a Habsburg woman was supposed to be, but her children would pay the price. And their children, and their children's children. Because when the DNA pool is just a puddle, there's only so far you can go before you drown in it. And with that, we now arrive at a man who didn't just inherit this legacy, he embodied it. The Bourbon prince who stood on the edge of revolution, scandal, and hereditary nosebleeds. Louis XVI of France, Marie Antoinette's unfortunate husband, and the man who brought the guillotine to a crown fight. Louis XVI of France. Louis XVI was the kind of king who could make a revolution look reasonable, not because he was evil or monstrous, or even especially tyrannical, but because he was hopelessly average in a job that demanded brilliance. Born in 1754 to the French royal house of Bourbon, Louis Auguste entered the world with the emotional poise of a frightened deer and the genetic inheritance of centuries of cousin marriages. His bloodline was tangled with the Habsburgs, the Spanish Bourbons, and pretty much every other royal house that believed marriage should be less about love and more about forming a circle on the family tree. And who better to continue the tradition than his bride, Marie Antoinette, his second cousin once removed, and an Austrian archduchess whose blood ran as thick with Habsburg jawlines as with powdered hypocrisy. Their marriage was a union of empires, treaties, and ancestral redundancy. It was also a total disaster. At 15, Louis was painfully shy, physically awkward, and already weighed down by the stifling expectations of Versailles. By contrast, Marie Antoinette was 14, flamboyant, culturally alien, and emotionally unprepared for a life that would be dissected by gossip pamphlets and protocol obsessives. Their wedding was an international event. Their bedroom was a diplomatic cold front. For the first 7 years of their marriage, it remained unconsummated, which is less surprising when you realize Louis may have suffered from a tight phimosis, a condition making intercourse not just difficult, but downright painful. Of course, no one dared say this aloud. Instead, courtiers whispered that the marriage was cursed, the queen was barren, the king was uninterested, or that one of them preferred barnyard company depending on which libelous booklet you bought that week. Eventually, the condition was fixed either surgically or miraculously, depending on whose version you read, and children followed, but the delay damaged them politically. In a world where producing heirs quickly was the only job that really mattered, 7 years of royal silence meant 7 years of pamphleteers sharpening their pens. Meanwhile, Louis XVI busied himself with lock-making, hunting, and being generally overwhelmed by state affairs. He wasn't stupid, just indecisive. He spoke multiple languages, understood Enlightenment ideas, and even supported American independence. But when it came to leading France through the boiling cauldron of fiscal collapse, he moved like a man trying to herd cats in fog. His biggest problem? Inherited instability, both political and biological. The Bourbon line, already decayed from intermarriage and excess, had spent generations perfecting the art of ruling through ceremony rather than substance. Louis XV, his grandfather, had been more interested in mistresses than ministers. Louis XVI inherited the consequences: a bankrupt state, a bloated nobility, and a peasantry paying the price. Still, Louis tried. He enacted reforms. He summoned the Estates General. He supported Necker, then fired Necker, then rehired Necker in a panic. He waffled on taxes, flipped on constitutional monarchy, and ultimately found himself a king with no army, no treasury, and no idea how to lie convincingly to a mob. Then came the revolution. It started with bread riots and ended with blood fountains. The monarchy crumbled with terrifying speed. Louis attempted escape twice. The first time, he was talked out of it. The second time, he disguised himself as a valet and fled toward the border with his entire family. He was caught in Varennes, recognized by a postmaster who compared his face to a coin. There are few more symbolic ways for a monarchy to die than being identified by its own currency. From there, the outcome was inevitable. The revolution escalated. The monarchy was abolished. Louis was tried, convicted of high treason, and executed by guillotine in 1793. His final words were dignified. His death was not. But what killed Louis wasn't just politics. It was a system, a dynasty so consumed by its own rituals and bloodlines that it bred itself into irrelevance. Louis XVI was the last king of France by birthright, and the last gasp of a royal bloodline so overbred it couldn't produce a leader when it mattered most. Because in the end, divine right meant nothing to a starving crowd. And yet, for all the tragic poetry of Louis XVI, his story doesn't stand alone. His fate was sealed by decisions made generations before by a grandmother who married her cousin, and by a system that mistook incest for stability. Which is why it's fitting to end this long, tangled saga where it so often begins, with the jaw that launched 1,000 pamphlets the Habsburgs themselves, and Charles II of Spain, the genetic punchline of an empire that couldn't stop marrying itself.